coming out for one thing. It's kind of miserable out there, but I just want to introduce you to Robert Bean. Robert Bean is a registered, and I'm going to read this because I know him differently than what this says. He's a registered engineering technologist, okay, in building construction through the Association of Science and Engineering Technology Professional. He's also sits on many ASHRAE committees. He's written many ASHRAE papers. He's also been a guest speaker many times for ASHRAE, and also probably at every plumbing and heating trade show in North America. He shows up and we get him to do guest speakers.
It's just a way of saying I need a life.
Yes, he needs a life, yeah. He's in, it's like most of us, right? We're in heating, that's all we know. We don't do anything else. So, Robert, it's all up to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming on, everybody. Yes, thank you. So, just out of curiosity, by a show of hands, how many people here, your responsibility is to make people comfortable? One way or another. Good answer. Okay, if your hand didn't go up, you're probably in the wrong room, okay? So, another question, if you're in the business of creating comfort or spaces that are comfortable, how many people know what the ASHRAE standard is for thermal comfort? It's 55, right? How many people have a copy of the standard? A few people do, all right. So of the people that have a copy of the standard, how many of you guys could actually list the 10 things that are required for thermal comfort? Anybody? All right, so this is a pretty standard response in a room full of people who are responsible for creating spaces that are thermally comfortable. Very few people have the standard, and even though the people that have the standard, very few could actually list the things that are inside the standard that have to be achieved in order to create spaces comfortable for people. So we're going to talk about that today. So our abstract is this. At the end of this, you'll be able to at least describe to people what the history is of thermal comfort. You'll be able to describe the criteria for compliance. Can you actually see to that? Let me get rid of this.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Anybody else that has it on the table that makes up on the sides? That would kind of annoy me.
Yeah. Does that cause a problem?
Yeah, I can't see through it. Do you guys want to keep that up there?
Behind. That's Superman can see through that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stand right here, so you and I are going to have a hard time. All right, and we'll show some of the design now. Who's the designers in the room here? Who actually sits down and crunches numbers? Okay, so there's going to be stuff there for you guys, and any inspectors in the room? Okay, there'll be a few things for you guys as well. And then, of course, we've got a bunch of students here. That's kind of annoying, that feedback, isn't it? Is that driving you guys crazy? No? It's okay? All right. If it gets bad, just
Move up a foot.
is that any better? All right. And then, of course, a lot of the stuff has to do with ASHRAE, and I just want to point out is that these are my views and not necessarily the views of ASHRAE, although a lot of them are going to be the same. So the history of the standard actually goes back a long time. It's actually one of the earliest standards that ASHRAE ever published was the thermal comfort standard. And we're now into our 2013 version. So there should be no excuse for you guys not having a copy of the document. If you're in the business of creating spaces that are comfortable, you ought to have the standard. Kind of makes sense, right? So if we go back and we look at the history of thermal comfort, it actually goes back a long, long time. In fact, if you go back into the days of Hippocrates, he was probably the first building scientist. Even though he was a physician, one of his things was to look at why people were getting sick. And rather than blame everything on the gods, which is what people did back then, he basically said it's because you have really bad hygiene. So that was sort of his history. But as you come in time, you also see these other guys who are doing research work. One of the things that you'll find out is that in the early days of research on thermal comfort, it was mainly the physicians that actually was doing the work. And the reason for that is, of course, they were doing house calls, and of course, when you're out seeing people's house calls, and you're seeing the hygiene in people's buildings, and of course, one of the reasons people were getting sick was because they were doing bad stuff in their houses. And then as you come up into time, then towards the end of World War II, you saw that the U.S. military and other militaries around the world, but particularly the U.S. government, started doing thermal comfort research with thermal mannequins. And this is when you really started to see modern, or the beginnings of modern instrumentation. And so what they did is they actually took these mannequins and they said, okay, well, these people are in high-stress environments, wearing all kinds of different clothing. How can we do what we can do to make them comfortable while they're getting shot at? Right? So that was one of their objectives. And then we started to see sort of the modern day post-occupancy surveys. So for those that are involved in LEED, who's involved in LEED projects here? Anybody? A few guys? All right. So one of the requirements, of course, post-occupancy surveys. And so this is just some of the early analog type instrumentation that was used. Quite a bit different than sort of the new stuff that we're seeing. I'm going to show you some of that on a couple of other slides. All right, so this is what you're looking at here is 2 slides from 2 different research facilities. The ladies are from the Danish Technical University, and what I want to draw attention to is notice the smiles on their face compared to the guys from Kansas State University. So clearly the students at Kansas State University were not happy about doing thermal comfort research work at the labs there. I don't know why that was, but obviously they don't want to be there. But in these laboratories is where actually some of the really early work that was done, and what they would do is they would take people into these labs, and their whole objective was to freeze them and bake them and dehydrate them and just basically make them miserable so that they could find out where their threshold of pain was. And so that was the work, the early work that was done at Kansas State University and the Danish Technical University. And then one of the researchers in America was a guy by the name of Fred Rolls. And Fred's, one of his jobs before he started doing thermal comfort research, his job was dealing with the chimpanzees that were sent up into space. So that was one of his projects. When those space programs were done with the chimps and they started putting real people into space, he didn't have a job, so he went to study thermal comfort research work. And he was one of the guys that really started to talk about the psychology of thermal comfort. And it's a fascinating part of the study for a whole bunch of different reasons. And I don't know if we'll get too much into it in this presentation tonight because we have an hour. But he looked at things like why is it that people can go into their cars, which are typically color-coded dials, thermostats, and they're completely fine. But when they go into their houses, they want to see numbers, right? So that was some of the stuff that he would look at, right? And then one of the things, interestingly, they did, they took 2 basically industrial freezers, and they established identical indoor climates inside of these freezers, except for one of them, they put couches and pictures and stuff. And then they had their students go in and they did basically post-occupancy surveys inside these industrial freezers. And what they found was that the freezers that had the furniture, like the couch and the paintings, they all perceived at least a 2-degree difference than the room that had nothing in it. And yet they were identical as far as climate conditions go. So that was some of his really interesting work. And then along came one of his students and colleagues later was Professor Ola Fangard, who actually started up the Danish Technical University program. And he wrote this book here, which was actually his PhD thesis. And who was I talking to had a copy of this? Yeah, right, oh, yeah, right. So you borrowed Ken's book, right? And so if you want to buy this book online right now, it's about $800-900 bucks. So if you can find it, you want to hang on to it. Okay? And as I was saying, there's actually one on Amazon right now for about 300 and some odd bucks. But you have to be careful because it might be missing one of the chapters in it because they did 2 publications and one of them kind of missed the chapter. So, anyways, very valuable book if you can get your hands on it. And then Dr. Settles from Penn State University was one of the sort of the specialists that works with what's called Schiller-in photography. I'm not talking about the infrared here, but I'm talking about these images here. And so using the Schiller-in photography, it's really sort of the first time that you're able to see thermal disturbances in a space and around people and around furnishings that we see in buildings. And so you can actually then see what these people can experience in these spaces exposed to different things. So I want to point out 2 things. This one here is actually a cooling system. So you see the nozzle, the discharge nozzle, and this sort of plume here. And this is actually a radiant-cooled ceiling. And so what you're actually seeing is the thermal plume from this individual, and of course the heat transfer to the cooler surfaces. So it allows us to actually see it. And one of the things I want to point out is look at the turbulence that's created with air-based systems versus radiant systems. Now that's kind of an unfair statement if you really want to get into the science. But one of the things that we do know with radiant-based systems is that they certainly have much more consistent temperatures, floor to ceiling height temperatures, than you get with typical air-based systems. Now that's kind of a general statement because you can design really good air-based systems as well, but you can see it there. So one of the things I want to point out, one of the tables that comes out of the ASHRAE handbooks, can you see? Sorry, in the way. Mr. Video Guy, you okay? All right. So one of the tables that comes out of the handbooks is this one here. And it just talks about when people are doing certain activities, wearing certain clothing, what their heat exchange rate is, and how is that heat exchange rate split up between both the sensible and the latent loads. So I'm going to draw your attention to just one example, and then you can fill in the blanks. So here we have the basic activity level, and then where that activity level would typically take place, and then you can see the heat transfer that's given off. Now, if this heat transfer isn't given off by these occupants, they get overheated. Okay? And if they can't get rid of it fast enough and it keeps building up, then they die, okay, which is not a good thing, right? It's really hard to come back from death. So we want to make sure that we establish conditions in a space that allow people to actually get rid of heat. Getting rid of heat is a good thing, okay, as opposed to retaining it. But the split is there. You can see between the sensible and the latent. And what I want you to make notice is that at relatively low velocities, the radiant transfer there on the sensible side is about 60%. Okay? And even in the higher met rate areas, the radiant still plays a big role. So here's a question for you. That thermostat up on the wall back there, is it measuring radiant or air, or is it a combination of both? What do you think it's measuring?
It's a combination of both.
Air.
Okay, 99.999% of all thermostats measure dry bulb temperature. And yet we know that the human being has a huge intimate relationship with the surrounding environments via radiation. Okay? So it's not a trivial thing. So let's talk a little bit about radiation. And what I want to talk about is the difference between shortwave and long-wave radiation and where we are. All radiation is actually good and all of it is bad. It depends on what direction it's traveling and at what intensity. So in terms of shortwave radiation, we're talking high intensity shortwave, actually has some benefits. We can use this particular range in radiation in germicidal. So you see that UV light treating coils and bacterial microbial contaminations. Of course, the visible light spectrum, which is in between these two, is good. It's nice to have colors, right? Otherwise we live in a pretty drab world. And then as far as heating goes, we're actually operating in this frequency. So these are just the frequencies that we're dealing with. This is shortwave high intensity, and this is long wave low intensity. And the human body operates at around 9.49 microns. So why is that important? Because one of the myths that occurs especially in the world of radiant floor heating and radiant walls, radiant ceilings, is that people are convinced by typically people involved in marketing and public relations that the radiant is going to heat them like the sun. How many people have heard that? Anybody? Okay, you've all heard, you've all read it in the literature, right? You're going to be heated like the sun. So what that is telling us is that if we're actually heating like the sun, then we're going to be actually operating these high frequency ends. If you're actually operating at that high frequency in your house, get the hell out because your house is on fire. Okay? We don't actually have that kind of a relationship with long wave radiation. When our bodies operate at the same temperatures or similar temperatures as the surfaces around us, what's actually occurring is that those warmer surfaces are enabling us to retain our body heat. It's the retention of our own body heat that gives us the sensation of thermal comfort, not so much that we're actually being heated by the floor or the wall or ceiling. Does that make sense to you? It's only when the temperatures get really high, like if you have radiant ceiling systems that are operating at a high temperature, where you end up at a higher or a shorter frequency, that you actually feel that heat. Okay? But in most cases on low temperature stuff, it's not that you're actually feeling so much the heat as you're actually retaining your own heat, and that's what provides the comfort. All right. So then one of Fanger's his first PhD student was Dr. Olson, Gary Olson, who's actually now one of the ASHRAE vice presidents. And one of his research projects was actually to look at the different temperatures on the human body. Okay, so he actually took people and did measurements. And so for those at the back that maybe can't see that, what we're looking at here is ambient temperature. So this is the room temperature. Over here is the actual skin temperature. And so what they found is that, are we working in Fahrenheit in this room?
Yes.
Fahrenheit? Okay, all right. So at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, that your feet are going to be running at around, say, 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? And then as the space temperature goes up, then your skin temperature also goes up. So one of the things in the ASHRAE Standard 55 talks about floor surface temperatures, and we'll come back to that, and it says what the limit should be, the minimum and the maximum. Part of that, in terms of thermal comfort, has to be has to do with what your skin actually operates at ambient conditions. Okay? This is also really important for later on in the second presentation tonight when we get into ASHRAE efficiency. We'll talk about operating temperatures of the human body and then fluid temperatures that we use in our systems. Okay, so we've come a long way from Hippocrates and Florence Nightingale and Douglas Galton and all these physicians that did research work, and then sort of the early instrumentation and the mannequins. But now we can use PET scans, positron tomography, and to look at what actually is the brain going through when its skin gets heated up and cooled down. So using this medical technology, we can see how the brain is activated as skin temperatures are heated or skin temperatures are cooled. So how many of you guys studied this in school? You guys taking this in school? Okay. So human comfort is not just the thermostat on the wall and the HVAC system and the building. It's a physical, physiological experience, and we can actually see that using these technologies. So I want to introduce you to Adam. Adam works for the automobile industry. He's worth about $1 million and some odd bucks. And the automobile industry hires him to sit in their cars and take readings from all the different parts of the body and feed it into a computer so they can tell the automobile manufacturers whether they're comfortable or not inside their cars. So let's look at Adam in a little bit more detail. If you strip Adam down, this is what he's going to look like in the inside, okay? All of these sensors. So just out of curiosity, how many sensors do you think you guys have on your skin that measures both heating and cooling changes? You want to take a guess? So if we took Leo here and we skinned him out like a bear, okay, put him up on the wall, he would cover about 20, 21 square feet. And in that 21 square feet, he would have, like all of you would have, roughly around 160, 166,000 thermal sensors. So that's about the size of a hood on a small car. Okay, is about 20 square feet. Okay? And so we take a $20 thermostat and hook it up to a mid-efficiency furnace in a room like this or a bigger room and call it a comfort system. So I want you in one side of your brain, take the medical model of thermal comfort with all of those sensors and how you sense comfort. We're going to get into that in more detail. And then the other side of your brain, put that $20 programmable thermostat with furnace and just, can you see that one of the problems that we have? We just don't give the human body the respect that it deserves when it comes to understanding thermal comfort. So these sensors are actually receptors, and they don't so much as measure the actual temperature as they measure the rate of change, the rate of the change that's going on inside the space. And that rate of change has actually been studied by physicians, and they look at the different firing rates, whether the body surface is actually heating up or whether it's cooling down. And so they know where the heat receptors are, and they know where the cold receptors are, and they know which ones actually measure pain as a result of overheating or pain as a result of cooling. So when you get really, really cold, what's interesting is that the firing or the frequency rate is very similar to the pain that you get when you're heated. So they know that just from the studies. So those sensors, here's one of the interesting things about the human body, is that the sensors are not distributed in a homogeneous way around your whole body. They're actually located in greater numbers in your extremities. When you look at your feet, and you look at your hands, you look at your head and your neck, you have greater numbers in these areas. So what I find fascinating about that is it doesn't matter where you go anywhere in the world, when you think about the clothing that people wear, regardless of their garb, they still have hands exposed, their head exposed, their necks exposed, and oftentimes their feet exposed. And so whoever created man, whatever your personal beliefs are, I think it's just wonderful engineering that took place. Okay. So what happens is that these receptors, of course, fire through your synapse systems, from your skin, through into your spinal cord, up into your brain, and travels into a place called the thalamus, which then is connected to the hypothalamus, which is connected to your pituitary gland, which is connected to your thyroid gland. Remember that kid thing? Elvis connected to the, remember that? No. Bill, you must remember. You must have played that as a kid, right? Do you want to demonstrate that? So anyways, it travels up ultimately to the pituitary gland, which is connected to your thyroid gland, which is basically the gas valve for your body. So we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. So when I look at the control of thermal regulation in the human body, I see not just veins and arteries, but I see like PEX pipe. And the human body controls the temperature from its core to the surface by controlling the flow, by dilating or constricting the blood vessels. So when we're beginning to overheat, what the body wants to do is it wants to, of course, dilate the blood vessels, forces more blood to the skin, and by forcing more blood to the skin, what happens to the temperature of the skin? It goes up. And as the skin temperature goes up, what happens to the delta T between the body and the space? It increases. And if the delta T increases, what happens to the rate of heat transfer from the body? Also goes up. So the body is a pretty amazing regulatory body. And of course, as it gets cold, then it reduces the blood flow to the skin. Of course, moves more of the blood flow to the core of the body to protect the vital organs. So I don't see veins and arteries, I see PEX pipe. And whoops. We'll let that catch up. And so that's what does the regulation, is the flow of blood. And of course, where that information comes from is, of course, the thermal receptors which are connected to your brain. Okay, so when you overheat, of course, what you're trying to do is you're sending more blood flow to the skin, and your sweat pores, or your pores in your skin, begin to release moisture, which allows you to cool yourself through evaporation. When you get cold, of course, the blood flow reduces, all the pores tighten up, your hair stand on end, you end up with these what's called goosebumps. So this is actually a SEM image, a scanned electron microscopy image of your skin when you're sweating. So what you're actually looking at here, these are actually just sweat pores, and you're just seeing little nodules of sweat, and of course, that allows you to evaporate through the latent cooling process, the last part of the cooling process going on. And then, of course, this is the goosebumps. Okay, so this is how it works from the mechanics, okay, or the sequence. We'll do the heating first. And so in a building, so the building science students here, put up your hands if you're a student. I know all you guys are there. Okay, great. So it's good to have you guys out. So we're gonna say that you guys have just designed this building, okay? And one of your clients has insisted on a really high window-to-wall ratio, so that basically things an oven, okay? So what happens is that the sun heats up the building, and as a result, the inside surface temperatures of the building heats up. Okay, what's going on, of course, and we're just going to assume that this is a wall. Outside is the sun, and of course it's got shortwave radiation hitting the building, comes in, conducts through the wall, and then it ends up heating up the surface. Okay, so if we take this whole wall, okay, and we say that's all exposed to southern exposure or eastern exposure, doesn't really matter, even west and the worst, then that becomes a great big radiator. Okay? And so if the temperature of this room, the radiation, the mean radiating temperature of the space goes up, what happens to the delta T between the body and that surface? Increases or decreases? It goes down, which means the body has less opportunity to shed its heat. And because it has less opportunity to shed its heat, it begins to overheat. All right, so the MRT rises, the sensors in your body pick up that rate of change, okay? Tells your brain, which is the thalamus, and the thalamus is like the gate or the air traffic control center. It takes this information from your nervous system and distributes it to the part of your brain that says, hey, I'm hot. It also sends it to the below conscious part of your brain, which releases all of the hormones, and we're going to get to that in a second. All right, so that's the thalamus, and then what happens is that you have this conscious perception. I'm hot, so you start to move away from the wall, you start to take off clothes, you start to turn on the fan, you start to turn on the air conditioning, whatever it takes, you start to adapt to your environment. Then the blood, of course, starts to send more fluid to the skin, which raises the skin temperature, allows you to release heat. So now you have that radiant exchange, you've got the convective component going on, plus you've got the evaporation. And when all of this starts to come into play, then the receptors start to measure that again, and then the body goes back to its normal temperature, sends a signal back to the thalamus and tells everybody just to calm down, everything's fine. Okay? So rather than go through the winter, which is basically the reverse, we're going to go on to the next slide, but that's sort of the mechanics of the whole process. Now, from a physiological point of view, this part of your brain up here is where you actually have that conscious thought that, hey, I'm hot or I'm cold. What's going on is that this part right here is called the thalamus, okay, that part of the brain, the center of that, not the whole thing, but the center. That red part there is called the hypothalamus. Okay, it's like the master chemist of your body, and then this is the pituitary gland there. So what happens is that the receptor information comes into the thalamus, sends it to the hypothalamus, which is connected to the pituitary gland, which then releases hormones to your thyroid gland. We'll get into that. So this is how it all works inside your brain. You've got the feedback mechanisms, both the thermal receptors and these hormones. And we'll talk about the hormones T3 and T4. But from a nervous point of view, the nervous signal comes in, and based on that firing rate, your body is going to have a conscious thought about how it feels, and then it's going to react at a physiological level, below conscious level. Okay? At a below conscious level, what it's actually doing is it's releasing a sequence of hormones, okay? Starting with your hypothalamus, which is like the thermostat operator, so it's looking at the firing rate, and it's looking at the concentration of T3 and T4 hormones. When it says that those aren't normal, there's a place we call homeostasis, it tells or sends a signal to the pituitary gland to release what's called a thyroid-stimulating hormone. That TSH hits the thyroid, and the thyroid says, hey, I've got a signal here to release T3 and T4 hormones, and those are basically like gas. It's the fuel for your body. Okay? So the thyroid is actually your gas valve, and the T3 and the T4 is the fuel. And what happens is when that T3 and T4 gets released into your body, it's actually searching for receptor cells that can increase the metabolic rate. So it's looking for muscles, it's looking for your lung capacities, it's looking for ways to process food in your stomach, and all of those types of things increase the metabolic rate so that you can start to feel warm again. That's what actually physically happens. All right. So now you know why I have such a vendetta against air-based thermostats. Because they're the worst ambassador to the HVAC system. Because that's what the thermostat is. It's supposed to be the ambassador for us as occupants to the HVAC system, which of course is connected or conditioning the building. And when you really start to study thermal comfort and you look at how we actually do it, it is incredibly barbaric using what we do today to condition people in spaces. Okay? Because we're far more than just air temperature. All right, so why study this stuff? Because within the ASHRAE Standard 55, one of the definitions is it's a condition of mind, okay? And it's a subjective condition, which means every one of us is entitled to our own belief of how we feel. None of us has the gift that we should say, you should be feeling comfortable, right? Or you should be feeling cold, or you should be feeling hot, right? You own that. And as designers and engineers, we need to respect that. What we can do, though, is we can design for the majority of the people. It's like a bell curve. We know under the bell curve, most people are going to function in that similar way, but there's always people on the extremes that no matter what you do in a space, okay, they're not going to be comfortable. All right? So we need to recognize that. So in the Standard 55, so this is really what is the DNA of the document, if you will. Okay? And we'll just work our way around very quickly. So relative humidity, which most people are familiar with, of course, drafts people are familiar with. Drifts and ramps. Drifts and ramps are changes in temperature in the space that occur either naturally or mechanically. Okay? So a ramp is something where we change the inside space condition mechanically, and a drift is something that occurs by natural condition. Okay? This is a huge area, particularly for those engineers that are using what's called thermally activated building systems, or TABs. Anybody familiar with thermally activated building systems? Nobody. Okay, if Jeff McDonald were here, he would know about it. Who knows Jeff? Anybody knows Jeff? Yeah, okay. So, why is this important? Well, Winnipeg Manitoba Hydro Building is a good example. Those buildings, or the cooling systems are designed, the load is actually designed for when the building is unoccupied. So when the building is unoccupied, there's nobody in the building, the computers are off, all the lights are off, and the sun is down. That is when the building has the lowest sensible load on it. And that's when the cooling systems are designed for it. So what they do is they actually operate the cooling system during the unoccupied periods, and they bring the temperature of the building down. Of course, they're buying power at a low rate, at the off-cycle rate, and so they're getting a smaller mechanical system, powered at a lower rate. And what they do then is that in the morning when the people come in, say around 6:37, they turn the system off, other than the ventilation load. The cooling is actually turned off. And then during the day, the building, because it's a big capacitor, it just absorbs all of the sensible load from the day. So as soon as the light comes on, the sun comes up, the people enter into the space, all of that stuff gets absorbed into the building. So that's what we call a drift. And as long as that drift can occur over the full 8 or 9 hours of the day, as long as it doesn't exceed a certain amount, then people will be will be very comfortable. Okay? It's an incredibly efficient way of doing cooling by reducing loads and operating this way. All right. The next, is temperature dry bulb, which most people, of course, are familiar with. This is what's called the average unconditioned surface temperature. Can you see that, Liam? Do you want me to move this out of the way? Okay. All right, and then we have what's called the mean radiant temperature, which we're going to come back to that in a lot more detail. We're going to actually show you how to calculate that out. The operative temperature is a marriage between the mean radiant temperature and the dry bulb. Okay? That's actually what people sense. They don't sense air temperature, they actually sense operative temperature. We have the temperature of the surfaces, specifically the floor, or those surfaces that can actually influence what's called radiant asymmetry, which is this up here. So radiant asymmetry is when, for example, we could take an individual that's in an office space, and I could have, maybe this is a wall here, and it's all southern exposure, and we have a cooling system going on, and maybe this side of my body is receiving shortwave intensity radiation, and this side of my body is cool. And that difference between the radiant surfaces is what's called radiant asymmetry. And the body gets all freaked out when it's over a certain amount, and we'll cover that. All right, so these are the 10 things that are in the standard. Okay? So if you're going to be in the thermal comfort business, like you said you're going to be, okay, then these are the things that you ought to know about. All right? So we're going to cover off on these, but the dry bulb temperature, which everybody's familiar with, and this is the default for most people, unfortunately, is it's actually the combination, it's the integration of all of these that actually has an impact. So dry bulb, mean radiant temperature, again, just quickly, if I was to sit here in this room, and I was to take a measurement of this surface there, and a measurement of this surface there, I'll try not to zap anybody in the eyes, this one here, and at the back, I could add all of those surface temperatures up, and I can give them a weighted average, okay? And it would change depending where I was in the room. So for example, if I was here, I have to watch out because the Mr. Video guy there, he doesn't want me to move around too much. So I could be here, and I would have a different relationship with the environment than, let's say, if I was in the corner. So if this is a glass wall, and it's like 11 o'clock at night, and it's minus 30 outside, that becomes one huge cold pane of glass, and my body's just going to shed its heat to that surface. But if I move over into the corner, just because of the relationship, the geometric relationship that I have, that would have less effect on me than if I was in this corner. Okay? So very important. All right, so all of that stuff gets put into the blender, and Fanger and his friends developed what was called the PMV and the PPD Index. So let me explain that. The PMV is basically what's called the predicted mean vote. We know that when you take that Rubik's Cube, all of those 10 elements, and if you get the Rubik's Cube solved, move to the right. If you get the Rubik's Cube solved, then you'll have the lowest PMV that you can, which means that the body does not have to react to its environment. But if you don't get the Rubik's Cube right, someone will begin to overheat or overcool, and then you become outside of this acceptable range of PMV, okay, the predicted mean vote. So this is the ideal range here. When we get too cold, you're over here. When you get too hot, you're over there. So what Fanger did is he took this data in his research and he said, okay, well, let's plot that against what's called a PPD, or the predicted percentage of people dissatisfied. And what he found was a correlation between the PMV and the PPD. So he said that if you can design spaces that are in this range, that you'll have the least amount of people dissatisfied. So on the y-axis is the amount of people you get mad, okay, if you don't do your job right. So if we do our job right, then we'll have at least 10% of people that will be unhappy, but 90% will be okay. And that really is the synthesis of this, of the 55 standards, that if we can do our jobs as building designers and mechanics and the contractors, 90% of the people in the space should be comfortable, provided that we do our job right. Anybody want to take a guess of where we're at? If you were to actually survey 1,000 people, what their satisfaction rate would be in a building?
What was the inverse of that?
It's just about. In the commercial world, it's anywhere between, say, 40 and 45% right now is the current sort of numbers that the Center for the Built Environment is running. Okay? We have a long ways to go, big improvement that can be done. Now, the negative side of this is that we know now that building performance and mechanical performance has obviously a huge influence on the indoor environment. The indoor environment has a huge influence on people's productivity and their ability to learn. And we know that students in good buildings have higher academic scores than those students that are in buildings that have bad environments. Okay? We know people are far more productive in buildings that have good environments than people that are in bad buildings. Okay? And when you look at the cost of a building over the lifestyle, or over the lifespan of a building, the human factor cost is on an order of 100 to 1 compared to the energy costs. It's huge. So the human factor should be our driving factor. So the methods in terms of ASHRAE 55, in terms of compliance, there's 3 methods: graphical, adaptive, or analytical. And I'll show you how those all work. So the graphical one, probably many of you should be familiar with this if you're familiar with the standard in thermal comfort. So basically it's just a psychometric chart. And what I want to do is I want to draw your attention to the x-axis, or the bottom value. And people typically, when they look at the psychometric chart, they see that as the dry bulb temperature. But in ASHRAE Standard 55, it's not a dry bulb, it's the operative temperature. Okay? That's really important to differentiate those two. So again, for the designers in the room, that is the merger of the mean radiant and the dry bulb temperature is the operative temperature. And that's actually what's on the x-axis, operative temperature. So we know that when you can maintain spaces that are within this operative range in this humidity zone at less than 20 feet per minute to air speed, and in clo value, which is the clothing, between 0.5 and 0.1, which is like in between light office clothing and heavy office clothing, that people will be comfortable. Now, for doing analysis outside of these temperature ranges and humidity ranges and air draft and clothing, you have to use a little bit more different method, which is the software tool, and we'll get into that. Now, you guys are in a climate which is interesting, a little bit different than the rest of Canada, that there is, you're in a warmer area, and within ASHRAE Standard 55, there is an allowance for adaptive comfort, which means that you can use open windows for cooling and for ventilation, provided that you're within this range. So what the ASHRAE standard says is that from a Fahrenheit point of view, if you can maintain indoor operative temperature conditions within this mean monthly outdoor air temperature, then you can use natural ventilation for cooling, thermal comfort, and for ventilation. The restriction is, right now in ASHRAE 55, is that if you use natural ventilation for cooling, you cannot, I'll repeat that, you cannot have mechanical cooling in the building. Okay? If you want to comply with 55. If you don't want to comply with 55, do whatever the heck you want, right? But if you want to comply with 55, then you cannot have any mechanical cooling systems in the building. Now, that right now is under debate within our committee, and we anticipate that there'll be some leeway given for mechanical cooling systems in naturally ventilated buildings, and we'll call it probably a hybrid system or something like that. But as it is right now, that's the rules of the game. So those are the graphical methods. Then you can get into the analytical method, which is the software tool. So the ASHRAE software tool allows you as designers to put in all of the input parameters. So air temperature, mean radiant, the clothing, your metabolic rate, all of that, put it into the blender, turn it on, and then it'll spit out whether the prediction is going to be within the PPD rate. So this is the values that we're looking at here, 8% PPD and 10% or PMV is a 0.45. So that's the analytical method. And I got to tell you that the Center for the Built Environment, which is the same people that wrote the programming for the ASHRAE one, have now launched their online version. So if you're note-taking, then what I would do is just put in your notes that you should take a visit to the Center for the Built Environment Thermal Comfort Tool. It's all online. You don't have to buy it, which is great. It's free. It's open source coding. And what it does is it allows you, again, to put in all the information, and then those that are doing lead projects, it'll actually spit out lead documentation for compliance purposes. So it's a great tool. So you can, basically, using the tool, you can input all of these different values, and it'll actually shift the curve, and it'll tell you where you are in the curve as a function of thermal comfort in the PPD and the PMV. It also has an ability to, I know because at the back you can't see this, also addresses the local thermal discomfort. So in those 10 items we showed earlier, you had the 10, and there was the 4 general, and there was 4 local. So the local discomfort are things like overheated floors or underheated floors or chilled floors, radiant asymmetry, air velocities. You can see them all up here. Okay? So there's the draft, floor surface temperature, vertical air temperature difference. What's interesting about local discomfort is that even though your general conditions might be completely fine and in compliance with ASHRAE 55, if any one of the local factors are outside of it, it will actually drive whether those people are comfortable or not. So you could have perfect temperatures, but if you have a cold floor, people will complain. So local thermal discomfort is really important when you're doing design work. Okay? And that's something you can actually calculate. All right? And then there's the adaptive method also is provided on the CVE tool. All right, so let's take a little bit more detail on the localized thermal discomfort. So Professor Olafanger in his Danish Technical University labs, they took all these people and they found out where people got mad when the temperatures were too hot or too cold. So they found out that at 10% PPD, 66 degrees is about the lowest that you want to have from the point of thermal comfort. It actually turns out really good because from a condensing point of view on a radiant floor cooling system, anybody here do radiant floor cooling? I know Derek, you at the back end, a couple other people, okay. So it actually works out really well because at that level you can still maintain 50% relative humidity in the space and not condense. Okay? So not only does it serve the condensation concerns, but it also serves the thermal comfort concerns. They also found that when you got over 84 degrees Fahrenheit on the floor, with people wearing normal footwear, that people would also start to complain beyond the sort of the 10% PPD. So that's where the floor temperature limitations come from. Then we got into looking at people that aren't wearing flooring. And again, for those at the back, you might not be able to see this, but what this is actually for people wearing socks or have bare feet. And what Fanger found, and Olsen in his research work, is that because you're not wearing shoes or anything that would prevent you from, or that intimacy between your feet and the floor, is that floor coverings played a big role in that sensation. So when you got into things like concrete, tile, slate, sort of those masonry type floor, they were very conductive, which meant they were very good at extracting heat out of the feet. Okay? But when you got into things like the more fabric-based flooring, so carpet for example, because they had a lower thermal conductivity, that they actually were obviously had less effect at extracting energy out of the feet. So on the concrete floors, you could tolerate a much higher temperature than what you would need, say, in a carpeted floor. So interesting stuff when you start to look at that. Then we looked at, okay, so operative temperature, which we mentioned, merger between the drywall and the mean radiant. That's what these lines here represent. And here's the surface temperature, and here's the flux. So we know that obviously there's a relationship if you're doing radiant floor heating or radiant floor cooling, that obviously the higher the flux, the higher the surface temperature is going to be for a given operative temperature. Okay? Or you can operate at a lower operative temperature at a given flux and have a lower surface temperature. So we're not doing a radiant design course here today, but that's the kind of stuff that we would get into in the radiant design course, looking at those relationships. Okay, then we get into radiant asymmetry, as we already explained. And again, so whether you have a warm wall or different surfaces there, the body gets twisted out of shape when it gets exposed to temperatures that are too high or too cool on either side of it. This is really important if you're doing radiant walls or radiant ceilings, or those that have really high window-to-wall ratios in your building, because that also has an effect on it. If you have lots of glass, that glass gets cold, and you're going to have radiant asymmetry. That glass gets hot, then you're going to also have radiant asymmetry. If you're doing radiant ceiling panels and they're just doing the perimeter and those are operating at a high temperature and for whatever reason the panels are encroaching over top of office space, you're going to have people that are going to complain about the radiant asymmetry in the space. Okay. All right, this is a great way of looking at radiant asymmetry. This belonged to a project of a colleague of mine from ASHRAE 55, and it was a client that had this glass wall exterior. And of course, obviously would have a really low MRT in the space, and to compensate for that, what they did is they actually heated the stairwell. So there's the support mechanism that's going up the stair, and you can actually see it. And so what they actually did is heated that, and of course then it just conducted out to the stair, and the whole staircase became a radiator. So that was one way they dealt with it. It was just a transient area too, so nobody was actually staying in that space. So it was a nice way of conditioning it, but you can really sort of see the radiant asymmetry that would occur in that particular area. Okay, and then as far as the difference between the head and the feet, this is always a good debate in our committee. And what we do know is that when you get into air temperature differences between your ankles and your head that exceeds 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit, as it gets beyond that, people are going to complain. And so we want to make sure that we keep those air temperatures as consistent as we possibly can. And we can do that through a combination of the building sciences, because our room geometry, the thermal performance of the wall, and in combination with our HVAC system can actually control that. And we know, and I don't know, Leo, if you've ever done these studies, but you can take a large building, we've done this with buildings at 40-foot ceilings, and switched over the system between an air-based system and a radiant-based system. And when you use a radiant-based system, we have really consistent temperatures, like within 1 degree over the 40 feet. But as soon as you switch the system over to like let the radiant system cool down and then engage the air system and let it operate and stabilize, we can easily have 10, 12 degrees difference between the floor and the ceiling. And it just all has to do with the buoyancy of the air and how we're actually conditioning that space. So it makes a big difference. All right, so some of the modeling that's done, this is actually using a CFD as one of the entries in the solar contest that we typically have down in Washington. So one of the students just looked at 2 different types of HVAC systems in their submittal, one with radiant, one with forced air, did the CFD modeling, the computational fluid dynamics, and this is the kind of results that they got. And then of course when they built the building and they did the actual measurement to validate the research or the modeling, it was pretty close to what they saw. And what you're seeing is high concentrations due to the air density in the upper part of the building versus the radiant-based systems. All right, one of the other things is that even though radiant has consistent temperatures between the floor and the ceiling, it's not immune from natural drafts. And in fact, what we're actually seeing here is a space, this is actually the space we did our research work in, where we had a flag up on the wall, and this was with the radiant floor system running. There's a sufficient amount of air mass moving due to the natural convective component to be able to move this flag off the wall so we can physically see it. So when people say there's no air movement in radiant, that's a lie. Okay? Physics tells us that there has to be movement in that space, so you actually can see it there. All right, going back to our temperature drifts and ramps, this is the details here. So again, if you want to change temperatures, as long as it's done over a long period of time, you can change as much as 6 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, well up to 4 hours during the cycle, and people will notice it less. But if you do that in, say, under 15 to 20 minutes, then people will complain. Okay. All right, going back to our operative, I mean, what time we got, by the way? And what time did we start at? Everybody got like 10 minutes left, or?
Quarter after.
Okay. All right. Okay, so oftentimes when we talk to designers and people, they tend to think of the world of architecture as this kind of homogeneous box. And they represent the condition in that box by airspace. But in fact, it's not homogeneous. It's very, very ambiguous. It changes. So we take this space like this, for example. Which way is south? I'm not from here. I'm from Calgary. So you better point out that's south. Okay. So let's assume that that's a glass wall. It doesn't have to be, but maybe it's got a 50% window-wall ratio. And this is the east side and the west side. So what happens in a space like this, and bigger spaces, is that the temperature, the operative temperature in the space changes as the sun begins to move across the structure. Okay? And so this is really important, particularly in big buildings, and depending on the aspect ratio, the length to width ratio as it's orientated to north or south can have a huge effect in the space. But what we want to appreciate is that we're not measuring the strictly drywall. Of course, the radiant has a huge component, and that's the operative temperature. So we actually sit there and we can actually say, okay, you know, at 9 o'clock in the morning, in this particular orientation, with this particular architecture, the way the building is built, we know the operative temperature is going to be at this condition at this time of the day. And that as, of course, the day changes, we can actually predict what temperature is going to be at, say, 3 in the afternoon or 4 in the afternoon. And that's useful information for programming a building. Okay? All right. So operative and dry bulb and mean radiant. This is how the relationship works. So these are the operative temperatures, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm just going to use this example here. So what we're saying is that at a dry bulb temperature of around 64.5 degrees and a mean radiant temperature of 22 degrees, you'd end up with an operative temperature of 68 degrees. And that's actually what's on the x-axis of the ASHRAE standard 55, and it's actually what people will experience when they're in a space. Okay? It also tells us that this whole concept of operative temperature is like a teeter-totter. Okay? So if the fulcrum is the teeter-totter, and on either side on the benches you have dry bulb and you have mean radiant temperature, what it tells us, in order to maintain a 68-degree operative temperature, if the mean radiant temperature goes up, the dry bulb has to go down. Conversely, if the mean radiant temperature goes down, the dry bulb has to go up. Okay, that's the relationship. It's like a teeter-totter. All right, now we're going to get into the math. So for the guys that like the math, okay, the formulas, we're going to start talking about mean radiant because it's a huge, huge influence. So there's essentially 3 ways of calculating it, and the standard goes through all of them, and as do the handbooks, the ASHRAE handbooks. So the first one is the area weighted, And it's actually the easiest and the most simplest, but the least accurate. Okay, so when we do a true mean radiant calculation, we actually position the person in the space and we define whether they're sitting or whether they're standing, and we look at the relationships. But in an area weighted calculation, all we're doing is we're just taking the surface temperature, which we can calculate, okay, and its area, and we're just assuming that the instrument, if you will, is in the center of the space, and then that will define the mean radiant. So that's the easiest way to do it. You just take the temperature, measure it, add it together, divide it by the total area, and you get the weighted average. Then we can do the radiant plane method, which basically breaks it up into the coordinates, x, y, z coordinates, and then assigns a value, and we'll get into that. And then the most complicated way, but the most accurate way, is to do what's called using the angle factors, which is what Professor Fenger did in his PhD thesis. And what he did is he said, okay, depending on where we are in the space, and depending on the surfaces within that space and the distances, it will have a corresponding influence on that person's perception of the space. It's really tedious, and it's a good thing that there's computers now, because in the old days, all of that was done by hand calculation. And you'll see when we get into the examples how tedious that calculation can be. So this is the first one, and it's just, this is the mean radiant, and so you just take your temperature times your area, you do this for however many surfaces that are in the space, divided by the sum of the areas, and then that gives us the mean radiant. So we take the mean radiant, we add it to the dry bulb, and that becomes our operative temperature, which is on the x-axis of the ASHRAE standard 55. Now, in the previous example, we had to calculate surface temperature. So there is several ways of doing it. The most simplest way is using this formula here, which comes out of the ASHRAE handbook. Okay? Or you can use some of the really fancy modeling programs. The FEA stuff is a nice way of calculating it as well. But you can actually calculate the inside surface temperature. So if you can calculate the inside surface temperature, you know the area, then you can do that calculation. The factors or the coefficients are also listed in the ASHRAE handbooks. Okay, so the radiant is simple. It doesn't matter whether you're on the floor wall or sitting, but the convective part of it is just based on whether the surface is upflow or downflow, or whether it's a vertical surface. Okay, so that punches into the formula, and you can calculate it that way. Now, I know none of you can see this. I can't even see that. But the nice thing about this method is it's really easy to put into Excel, and I love Excel. Leo, Excel fan? Yeah. It's probably the best engineering tool that's out there, right? Because you can take these really simple formulas, you can build really simple spreadsheets, you can take spaces really quickly, put them into the spreadsheet, and within 10, 20 seconds you got your answer. Okay? As opposed to doing some of the more complicated software tools would take you a long, long time. So Excel can be your friend on these calculations. So the next method is the plane radiant. And so what the plane radiant basically does is it looks at the panel facing up, down, to the right, to the left, the front, and the back. As I said, it broke it up into the x, y, z coordinates, and it takes a factor. And so if you know the temperature times the factor, then you can calculate the mean radiant temperature based on that methodology. So it's a little bit more accurate than the area weighted because it acknowledges whether the person is standing or seated. There's two formulas. So you get those out of the ASHRAE handbook. So again, easy to put in an Excel spreadsheet and do the calculation. Then you get into the angle factor, okay? And this is the one that gets really fun, okay? And so let me just explain the geography here of the slide. So your temperature, your panel, and then this F of P, and these represent each of the surfaces in the room, the angle factor. So this is what happens, okay? So I'm going to sit down here. Well, maybe not, because just a video guy over there doesn't want me to sit down, but I'm going to sit down here. Okay, so what happens is that we take an individual, okay, and we basically say, okay, this is the center of gravity. And we say, okay, everything above the center of gravity from the right-hand side is going to have an impact on me. Everything directly to the right is going to have an impact on me. Anything to behind is going to have an impact on me. And I do that all the way around the space, okay, in quadrants. And I look at the ceiling. I break the ceiling up into quadrants, and I do the same thing. Okay? Then I do the same thing for everything below the center of gravity. Okay? So all the students are eating this up. They're going, yeah, I get this, man. This is good. Okay? Because you can put all this stuff into a spreadsheet. We have, actually, or you can use the modeling programs. So once you do that, then you can go to the different graphs and you can work with the formulas. So these angle factors can be derived by these factors, and I'm going to show you where these come from. using these factors here. And those factors all come from this table. And that table is in one of the REBA handbooks. So it's really easy to get this information. But I want to talk about where these values come from, because these ones all come from this formula here, which comes from here, okay? Pretty simple stuff. So here's where those ratios come from, the A and the C and the A and the B. What it basically says, and this is what Fanger did, because he had nothing to do for 4 years, I guess. So he took these people and he took these panels and he said, okay, this is the angle factor as a result of the dimensional ratio, so it's a geometric relationship. I apologize for those guys that don't do math for a living or aren't in the engineering world. If you're just contractors, you're probably looking and going, this is one hell of a waste of time, right? But for those that do design work, this is the kind of stuff you should be doing when you're doing thermal comfort analysis. So it looked at the distance from the person to the panel, and then it looked at its height and its width. And then based on those relationships, you could come up with the factors, and that's where these came from and where those values. Those values get punched into the formula, and then you can solve for your mean radian. Piece of cake, right?
Is that actually being done?
Yeah, so when you do ASHRAE 55 compliance, you have to go through, you have to demonstrate that you've actually gone through this calculation, or demonstrate why you don't need to do the calculation. Okay? So there is an out. Okay, there's always a relief valve. Okay? So the relief valve is, in the ASHRAE Standard 55, there's a formula that says that if the results of this formula, and that formula is based on the U value of the wall, if it's within this range here, you do not have to do a mean radiant temperature calculation. You can assume that the mean radiant temperature equals the dry bulb. Okay. So there is an out. Or you can use the software, which is really easy to use. Okay, so the operative is just the mean between the two. So this is the ASHRAE software, and the CBE online tool unfortunately doesn't do that yet. But I know the guys at CBE, and I know that this is one of their projects that they're going to be working on. But right now, you can do these calculations in the ASHRAE, and it just allows you to define the space. You can put your person in there, create all the coordinates, and if you can calculate the surface temperatures and you know all your wall characteristics and ceiling characteristics and floor characteristics, you can then calculate using the software. So that's, you can take a space like this, and once you get good at it, you could probably have an MRT calculation done in under 7 minutes.
What is the magic U value that lets you bypass all the calculation?
What's that?
What is the magic U value?
I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. It's in the appendix.
Preferably or
What it is, so what it would be is that like the MRT would have to be within 2 or 3 degrees of the dry bulb, which means you'd have to have a fairly conservative window to wall ratio. And you know, so for a climate like Vancouver, you know, you're probably looking at, you know, a 40% window wall ratio, and you'd have to stick with probably R20 insulation, something like that, on your walls. Just a guess. That was being recorded, I probably shouldn't have said that. Did I emphasize that was a guess? Yeah, good. I just want to make sure that was a guess. All right. So
sounds too easy.
So then, it's a single formula. It's actually pretty simple, actually. I don't have it up here, but I can show it to you afterwards if you want to take one. Okay, and then for those that are ASHRAE members and you've been contributing your membership dollars, one of the research projects that was just completed last year was a 3D modeling tool that you can either take the geometric inputs from the ASHRAE thermal comfort, actually married together, or you can use SketchUp. Anybody here using SketchUp? You can do your models in SketchUp, and you can import it in to this. And what it'll actually do is it'll actually tell you what the mean radiant temperature is anywhere within the space, at any height within the space. So what you're looking at here is just a screenshot. And so it actually just defines what the temperature is going to be based on this color code. And you can move this plane up and down, okay? And you can change the geometry of the space. It can do actually, not in the ASHRAE ones, only a very simple boxes, but in SketchUp and in Energy Plus, you can create multiple geometric spaces, like U-shaped buildings. You can do that, and then you can do the calculation. All right, we're getting close to the end of the presentation. Operative thermostats do exist. This is actually a open source manufacturer, which means anybody can take the information from them and create your own operative thermostat. So it's not a particular brand. It's kind of neat, actually, the guy doing this. Just to give you an idea of what's going on is that he's got basically a glorified globe sensor. So it's in this sphere, and so it's receiving the radiant exchange from in the space. Plus he's got another sensor in here which is convective. So he's just marrying those two signals together to derive an operative temperature. And that's really what, that is the industrial design or the product realization from the formula. Okay, it's right there. It's the operative temperature plus the mean radiant together to give you the operative temperature. So operative temperature, operative thermostats do exist. There's another one that senses the MRT. Okay, so again, and you'll see those. All right, two last slides. Has to do with some of the research work that has been done most recently, looking at research, what is a compilation of research work. And so what they did is they looked at the data from around the world in various buildings, and they wanted to know what people were providing in terms of post-occupancy survey. What was driving them crazy in buildings, and what influence did it have on a positive effect, and what influence did it have on a negative effect. So let me explain how this actually looks. So let's just take one example, so then you'll understand how the rest of them went. So the temperature here, this upper bar had an impact on overall satisfaction, and the bottom part has an impact on the overall dissatisfaction. Okay, so these are like magnitudes, like how much anger do I have because I'm cold, okay? Or how happy am I because I got lots of space. That's basically what we're saying. So in this worldwide study of the data, they found the biggest thing that made people unhappy had to do with the amount of space in their offices. When they were crammed into little cubicles, it absolutely drove them crazy. Okay? And when they had lots of space, of course, it had a positive impact. So look at the height of the bar. Okay, this just says on an overall satisfaction, they're really happy to have lots of space, and they're really unhappy to have no space. And they did that for all of these metrics in the indoor environments, or what we call the ergonomics of the indoor space. And the ergonomics of the indoor space would be everything from in terms of environmental conditions to the actual space itself, colors, these types of things. A lot of this stuff is related to interior design, and one of the things that we encourage, and we've been doing it now over and over and over again, both in our website and in our courses and in our clients, that the HVAC community and the building science community needs to be working more hand-in-hand with interior designers because they have such a huge influence on the clients. And we know that when you can work with the interior designers, because they seem to get this indoor environmental stuff more than builders and engineers. The interior designers seem to get it. And so one thing we find out is that when we work with the interior designers, we can influence them on the decisions that get made related to these types of results. All right, so let me just explain one last thing here. When you look at today in buildings, as far as things that the human body senses, your own individual sensory systems, that light has a big influence, and noise. In terms of the negative, right now noise is probably the #1 biggest thing in buildings. Okay? And the reason for that is that in this drive to improve indoor air quality, the amount of fabric-based sound absorbers has gone down. Like we started to use more woods, steels, concrete, the masonry stuff, which are very bad at absorbing sound. So you get lots of echoes in the space like this, right? So sound is a huge, huge thing. And then next to sound is actually thermal comfort. And then next to that is indoor air quality, which is really interesting because in the world right now of architecture and science, indoor air quality is getting a lot of attention. And it should. It's an important thing. But in terms of what people are telling us, it's sound, thermal comfort, then indoor air quality. All right, last slide has to do with genders, which is really interesting work. In fact, there's a new paper that was just released this year on gender differences as a function of indoor environmental quality factors. And I haven't read it yet, but it's in my library. And what they found, this is on those that voted on the negative scale. So these are individuals that weren't in that place of homeostasis. They were actually unhappy. And so what you're actually looking at is that the trend is that the females tend to have a higher dissatisfaction rate than the males for all of these parameters. Okay? I'll leave that one alone. I'm not going to get into political fights. But one of the things is that certainly with our client base is that we always try to recommend that two people get involved in the decision-making process. And one is kids and one is women. And because if the kids and the women had it their way, we would actually have much more comfortable spaces. Ladies, would you agree with that? For some reason, whatever it is, they have a better perception of what's actually happening within the space, and they'll vocalize it. Okay? Where guys will just sit there and say, suck it up, right? Right? So if we had it our way, from an environmental ergonomics point of view, we would actually engage the females as opposed to the males, which is one of the reasons why we like working with interior designers, because predominantly they're female-based. Okay, so huge, there's a lot there to learn from the research work. Anyways, 4 projects that sort of followed along in this philosophy of designing for the human. In other words, these buildings actually were designed from the inside out as opposed to the outside in. The traditional approach of architecture is the client sits with the architect and they develop a set of plans, and then all of the geometry is done for the building, and then they give it to the designers, the electrician, electrical engineer, the mechanical engineer, and say, okay, now you make our building work. Right? That's their traditional approach. But what we find is that when you start with the occupant and you work your way outwards, right, and you say these are the environmental conditions that we want to have inside the space, this is the energy budget that we want to work with. Now, Mr. Architect, you make our systems work. Completely changes the paradigm of how buildings are done. Because when you start with the occupant and you want to create really good thermal comfort spaces and good lighting and good sound, and you want to do it for the lowest energy load that you possibly can, it forces the architects to start to improve the building enclosure, which is what you guys are all about. It starts to make them look at window profiles and window performance in a way that they've never looked at it before. Because everything on the inside has been defined. Now you fix the outside. Right? And it's a really interesting place to be. And these 4 buildings were really good examples of that, where the clients knew right off the bat that they wanted to have people that could learn inside their spaces at a higher level than any other place. They wanted to have people that were at a high level of productivity, which meant that they have to have really good indoor environmental ergonomics. And so the Winnipeg Manitoba Hydro Building is one of those. The NRL building in Colorado is another one. The Bullitt Center in Seattle. And this is the Infosys building in India. And the 4 things that these buildings have in common: all dedicated outdoor air ventilation systems, okay? All with radiant cooling and radiant heating, so both, except for the one in India, just cooling only, and a high component of natural resources, okay? Hydropower, PV, thermal, solar, one of these elements. So that's some really good examples of buildings around the world where this stuff actually works, demonstration projects. So the message there, of course, that buildings aren't uncomfortable, people are, and that should be our message. That's it. That's all I have to say for the first part of today. Any questions? Yes?
Not directly related, but first one, this operative thermostat, is that on the market in North America? And what is its output signal? What can we drive with it?
That one, I don't know what the output is, whether it's a 4 to 20 or a 0 to 10, couldn't tell you. And there are some, but you have to dig deep to find them. I don't know what our policy here is on brand names, but you can come up afterwards and I can, or I can take, what's that?
No policy.
Let her rip.
So all your big, like Siemens, all of these kind of companies will have those types of thermostats, and it's particularly in Europe or Asia that they have it, not in North America.
Are we wasting our time using that level of thermostat on an air-based system?
No, in fact, it actually improves it because the air-based system isn't measuring radiant. So they're having that extra radiant element actually gives the thermostat more information that it didn't have before. And you don't have to necessarily use an operative-based thermostat. You can emulate it by embedding sensors in the wall and then merging that signal with the air signal, and that'll give you an operative. So you can embed a sensor in that wall, like just representative walls. And as long as you aren't distorting the signal line, but overweighting one, and there's technology to do that now, that you can measure, take these signals, and then you can average it out and get your operative temperature without using an operative thermostat.
The second question is completely off the wall. I can't think of a better person to ask. If you have 2 identical houses...
That's not saying anything about me, is it?
I didn't want to bury you with this, but this has been a debate we've had in this room here for the last 15 years. You have 2 identical houses, and you have comfortable people in both of them, so the operative temperatures presumably be close to the same. One is heated with air-based system was one heated with a radiant-based system.
Right.
In a theoretical point of view, or practical point of view, which would have a higher cost of heating given the same combustion efficiency and the same source of fuel?
Wow, that's a loaded question.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm going to refer to some research work. That's always good to have the research work. So there was a research project that was done in New York State, and it was a Habitat for Humanity project. There was 2 identical houses, exactly as you just described, and what they found is that the home with the radiant system, from a thermal point of view, was slightly higher than the home with forced air.
Does that
From-
seem logical to you?
Yes. Okay, I'm going to explain that. But from an electrical point of view, the home with the radiant had less than the forced air. So because the principles of wire to water efficiency or wire to air efficiency, the blower versus a pump. Okay, so the pump obviously operates at a much lower or a higher efficiency than the air one, and so you get that electrical savings. Now, going back to the slight increase, these homes were identical, which meant that both slabs were insulated to R10. Okay? So from a thermal perspective, the radiant floor obviously had a higher delta T in the slab than the forced air did. The slab in the forced air system will never get any higher than the air temperature in that space. But the temperature of the slab with radiant obviously is going to be higher than the air temperature in the space. So you have an increase in delta T between the slab and the concrete. Even with the insulation, that's why it was a very slight amount. Okay, and I don't remember, it was like a 0.5 or 1% increase. So almost nothing to really to say about, to complain about. Having said that, the people in the radiant home, even though from a analytical, academic point of view, the numbers were the thermal comfort was the same, the people in the radiant house were much more comfortable, they said, from an anecdotal point of view, than the people that were in the forced air. So, that was one real live research project.
Question.
Yeah.
Does anybody apply the ASHRAE standard 55 to a passive house where we're talking, quite a dramatic reduction in energy load?
Right. So the passive house has
From a
a
research point of view.
probably in Germany. I would guess that they probably did. And over there, they would be working with the ISO 7730, which is the European standard for thermal comfort. So I don't know of any specific. I can't give you any research work per se, but I have to think that they've worked with it. Can't see them not. It's just not in the German housing industry to not look at those things. Any other questions? Did you guys learn something tonight?
So if you build the perfect house from inside out and all that kind of stuff, and you build the perfect comfort system in the house, how do we still deal with those 2 occupants who have completely different
Drugs.
ideas of what they're
Different drugs.
Women in one, men in the other.
because there are those differences still. And,
So adaptability, that's it. That's all. That's what they have, right? Yeah, so.
okay, fair enough.
But it's a really good question, and it has a really heavy weighting, particularly in indoor air quality. So let's set aside, thermal comfort is easy because you can take off sweaters or put on socks, or you can actually dress for it, right? But in indoor air quality, that becomes really challenging because there are some people who just have bodies that are really, really sensitive, and you can't, if you got like 5 people in the house and one of them is really sensitive, then it makes it really hard for that one person, right? Because it's not like they can move anywhere. Think in terms of children or the elderly, right? Or the infirm, those that actually can't get away from it, and so they're stuck. So you have to build your building around that particular individual's needs as opposed to the needs of the others.
Would it be reasonable to assume the bell curve would flatten out though, instead of being as extreme?
In air quality,
Well, the whole picture, talking about the discomfort levels, people who are uncomfortable will be less uncomfortable. Is that fair?
yeah, that's a fair statement. Yeah, absolutely. So it's like you're eliminating all things that they can complain about, right? So you're kind of knocking down that bell curve. Yeah.
Does ASHRAE 55 cover like fitness facilities?
Okay, so really good question. So it only covers up to a certain met rate, and for a certain period of time, and air velocities. Okay, so it's one of the areas that is not covered, and it doesn't cover anything other than normal adults who are healthy. So one of our, as a member of these committees, one of our objectives is to do planning, and one of our planning is to look at these other activity levels. Good question. Any other ones? Going, gone. All right, thank you very much. We'll see you guys after. All right, so we're going to get into part 2 of tonight's presentation, which of course is about what I call the E5, energy, actually, efficacy, and five E's. And of course, the previous discussion we talked about thermal comfort, which of course is about conditioning people in spaces, and of course that takes energy. And so tonight, the second part 2 is to talk about this energy from a perspective that maybe perhaps some of you have not looked at before. So how many people in this space, in the room tonight, are familiar with exergy efficiency, second law principles? Got 1, 2 people, okay. 3, okay, great. So certainly in my humble opinion, I think at the end of the day, society will be judged by our exergy efficiency as opposed to our energy efficiency, and we'll explain why. We'll also explain why probably the biggest paradox in this century is the paradox that as we improve the efficiency of buildings and condition them with combustion-based systems, that we actually have less exergy efficiency rather than more exergy efficiency. I'll explain why that happens. All right, so we'll get past all this stuff so we can get into the content. We already went through that. All right, so when you look at the global economy and you look at developed nations, the biggest energy hogs on the planet are those that have these 2 things. They use a lot of combustion, they do a lot of customization. In other words, they build one-off systems like we build houses, one-off. And there's a lot of complexity. And it's those 3 things that are common to all of the countries in the world that tend to use more energy on a per capita basis than any other countries. So I want to introduce to you a graph. This was a graph that we developed for the ASHRAE Indoor Air Quality Conference. It was here in Vancouver last year, 2013, 2012, I can't remember. You guys know? Students? No? You said you know. Okay, it was either 2012 or 2013. And what we did is, it was a literature review, and we looked at projects that were published in the ASHRAE High Performance Building Magazine, or projects that were featured around the world in different research papers. And then we looked at what was their common denominators. And then we looked at buildings in our own database going back 30 years, which were all bad buildings, and we looked at what were their common denominators. And so rather than create like a 150-page paper, which nobody was going to read, we created a graph. And we graphed energy performance, we graphed energy fluxes, also BTUs per hour per square foot or watts per meter squared. We graphed the combustion temperatures. We graphed temperatures that you would find on the human body. We graphed temperatures that would be in hybrid HVAC systems. And we also graphed efficacy. And efficacy we describe as being sort of the thermal consistency in a space. And we graphed a whole bunch of other things that were related to temperatures in both bad buildings and good buildings, and we created a graph. Okay, so if I die, this is my legacy, is this graph. Okay, so for those of you that are familiar with the psychometric chart or the ASHRAE Figure 9 nomograph and the ASHRAE handbooks, those are very busy graphs. Well, ours is a busy graph too because we didn't write the paper, we did the image. So I'm going to throw it up on the screen. Lots of stuff is going to hit you. But what we're going to do in the next hour is we're going to show you how this graph was built and why you need to pay attention to the information on it. So you ready? Okay, so this is the graph. So for those at the back, don't worry about the text. I'll actually explain it. So if you just keep your eyes on your slides up here, I'll explain everything. So on the y-axis on the left-hand side, this was the building performance. So we're talking about high-performance buildings, good performance, moderate, and poor buildings. Then, how we establish these is we look at the flux. Okay, so BTUs per hour per square foot. So what we said was that bad buildings typically had energy fluxes that were over 40 BTUs per hour per square foot. Those bad buildings also typically were associated with high operating temperatures, so down on the y-axis is the operating temperature. And the reason why they were associated with high water temperatures is because they used very small heat exchangers. So typically baseboard, fan coils, fan convectors, that type of stuff. So high loads, small heat exchangers, really large increases in temperature. Okay? Then we looked, and then we just went down our database and we said, okay, well, high performance buildings typically had fluxes less than 10 BTUs per hour per square foot. They typically had really large surface area heat exchangers, so radiant panels, either walls, floors, or ceilings. And they ended up with fluid temperatures that were in and around the operating conditions of the human body. Okay, so that's the load, that's the operating temperature, and this is the flux. Then what we did is we looked at thermal efficacy. So what we found is that in the bad buildings that used high temperatures and small heat exchangers, is that they had really discomfort that was due to temperature stratification or hot and cold spots throughout the building, really bad radiant asymmetry, all of the things that we just talked about in the previous presentation. But when you got into the high performance buildings that had the low fluxes and the large surface area heat exchangers, particularly those that use dedicated outdoor air systems, that they had really good efficacy. So we're going to talk about efficacy, we're going to talk about building performance, we're going to talk about operating temperatures. So again, bad buildings, 200 degrees and under. High performance buildings were actually conditioning people in spaces with less than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So to put that into perspective, when we got into some of these high performance buildings, we were seeing heating temperatures that were in the 78, 80, 85 degree water temperatures. And now, put that into scope, that's actually cooler than your core body temperature. Condition people and spaces with temperatures lower than what you find on your human body. So that is a key component of what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. Oh, and the last thing I want to point out on this slide is that, and this is what I want you to think about while we're actually presenting for the next hour, is that we know that we can condition people and spaces with temperatures less than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but the combustion temperature of natural gas or hydrocarbons, this is a rough number, give or take a couple hundred degrees Fahrenheit, is around 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit. So what I want your brains to ask is, why are we generating 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit when we only need 100 degrees? That introduces us to the topic of exergy efficiency or exergy inefficiency. Okay.
Oh, just before you get off the slide, when
Yeah.
you're talking about heat fluxes, was that BTUs per square foot of living space or exterior wall?
Floor space. So if you took the floor space, available floor space for conditioning,
Okay,
that's what it was based on.
got it.
All right, so first we're going to talk about building performance and the changes that are going on in building performance. We'll talk about the heat exchangers that are used in these buildings, in particular their spaces and their operating temperatures, and then we'll move on to part two. So the first thing, of course, is looking at building performance, which has a huge impact, obviously, on thermal comfort, but also, of course, in terms of energy or energy consumption. So in terms of fenestration systems or glazing, this came out of a European research project, and they looked at the inside surface temperature of the glass when you're using without solar shading and with exterior shading. And so you can see the intensity that occurs on the inside of the glass when you have no shading, and of course the intensity much lower when you have exterior shading. Okay? So as we talked about earlier, in terms of radiant asymmetry, when you have glazing systems that have very poor shading, the temperature in the summertime goes up and in the wintertime it goes down. And of course that has a huge impact on the mean radiant temperature and of course the occupant's thermal comfort. Okay? And of course obviously it has a huge impact on energy costs. Okay? So glazing and shading is really important. Then we did an FEA study, buildings looking at the result of exterior insulation. So starting out with 2x4 and 2x6 walls, and then increasing the amount of insulation on the outside from 1 inch up to 4 inch, I think is what we did in this particular study. And our objective was we wanted to know what the influence was on the temperature at the stud location as we increased the exterior insulation. And of course what that had an impact on, of course, was the mean radiant temperature again, right? So if we had no exterior insulation in the 2x4 wall, we had a cold wall, that dropped down the mean radiant temperature of the space, which increased the delta T between the body and the space, which could which resulted in thermal discomfort. All right? When you increase the insulation, then of course you have a warmer wall. So what we're representing here, that echo is driving me crazy. Can you guys at the back still hear me? Hello? Bill, can you hear me? Are you awake though?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
I'm listening while I'm sleeping.
Yeah? Perfect. I'm sleeping while I'm talking. It's a good match. All right, so what we did is, doing the FEA study, then we looked at, okay, so in a bad wall, the occupant, and this is the occupant here, and what we're looking at is the mean radiant temperature, the dry bulb, and the operative temperature. So these are the temperature that we're measuring. This is the temperature of the skin of the human body. And then this is the range of temperatures that the human body was exposed to at that wall during the 365-day period. And of course, with a bad wall, the inside surface temperature goes from the extremes, in the summertime to the winter. Now, when you improved the insulation on the outside of the building, of course, it made the wall warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. And as a result, the human was only exposed to small swings as opposed to the large swings here. And of course, that difference was all energy savings. Do you see that? Okay, so that's one of the messages in terms of improving wall performance, is not only the reduction in energy, but the improvement in thermal comfort. Then we did an FEA study looking at downward losses of slabs that were heated, okay, either heated on one side and not heated on the other side. And I don't know if I have all of the slides here, but what we did is we looked at no insulation, 1 inch, 1.5, 2 inch, 3 inch, and 4 inches of insulation. And we looked at the thermal plume that was created as a result of having no insulation versus having insulation. And you can see, obviously, there's a thermal difference there. Yeah, that's the only slide I have. But in the sequence of slides, we actually showed the difference. So, and those are on the website. So if you want to go to the website, you can see the sequence of all of the different changes. Then we looked at the trend in infiltration and exfiltration in buildings. And this actually comes from the CMHC NRC-IRC study, looking at different ventilation and leakage in buildings. And of course, we know that the older buildings leak like a sieve, but the newer buildings, of course, are tightening them up. And so you can get into the sort of the extreme case, which is a passive house, which today is sort of the tightest standard that's out there, 0.6 ACH 50 compared to, say, the R2000 or these other areas. So we know certainly that buildings on the residential side are certainly tightening up more so, of course, than in the past. So the old and the new. So we definitely know that we're going through a transition. We've always been going through a transition. When I graduated in 1983, the R2000 program had just been out for like 4 or 5 years. One of our class projects was to look at the very first BANI air-to-air heat exchanger, because we can use brand names, right? So radiant heating was just starting to get into full swing. Condensing boilers were just starting to show up on the marketplace. And the solar program was probably in its last or 2 years before they pulled away the funding. So that was back in '83. Well, welcome to 2014, and we're still in 2014. And of course, solar, right? Condensing boilers, radiant, right? All of this stuff. So nothing much has changed over the 30 years. Just, I guess, maybe our application knowledge is better. But we certainly are going from sort of the old leaky buildings to sort of more new, tighter buildings with higher performance enclosures. So from a load perspective, looking at windows, looking at walls, slab insulation, infiltration, exfiltration, all of that, that's how we defined our load. So we went from a terrible building to the traditional building, to the more transitional building, where this is where we are right now, and to where we're actually heading towards the terrific building. So this would be your passive house, or your R2000 house on steroids, or some of the new net zero energy projects here. So this is, a lot of buildings were built like this, and we went through a housing boom in the continent. A lot of the old houses, of course, are like this. This is where we are right now, and we're heading towards that area. So 2 of the rules that I like to apply here in terms of efficiency, the dinner rule. So you know that, right? So take what you need, but use what you take. So if you're going to use energy, try to use as much of it as you can. Don't waste let a whole bunch of stuff stay on the table. But the one that's most important, again, goes back to this concept of actually has to do with temperature. And we're going to talk about our sense of our intuition for what is right and what is wrong. And today, using combustion is like using a sledgehammer to pound in a finishing nail. It's just not the right thing to do. We're going to explain that in detail. Okay, so that's how we actually got the load part of the graph. Okay, so from our high performance building at low fluxes to our poor performing buildings at the high fluxes. Then we looked at the heat exchangers that were associated with these different buildings. And so just looking at the standard heat transfer equation, so you're going to look at the characteristics of the material, the area, and then of course the delta T across it. That's going to drive, of course, our heat transfer. So when you look at heat exchangers, and you look at the log mean temperature difference, and you look at, part of that, of course, is looking at surface area, that we know that when you use large surface area heat exchangers, you can use really low temperatures in heating and high temperatures in cooling. And of course, that has a huge impact on the efficiency of the chillers, the heat pumps, and the boilers. But when you get into small heat exchangers, then of course you need higher temperatures in heating and cooler temperatures in cooling, and that destroys the efficiency of the equipment. Okay? So if I had it my way, we would actually start with the efficiency of the equipment and we would work backwards, right? As opposed to doing the load and then trying to find the equipment. We'd actually start with our COPs and our efficiency and say, okay, in order to get this efficiency, these are the temperatures that need to come back to it. How do we get those temperatures? We have to look at the heat exchanger. How does the heat exchanger relate? We look at the surface area. How big is the surface area and the temperature? It's a function of the building. So what do we have to do with the building? That's how we should do design, okay, as opposed to the other way around. Okay, so obviously surface area has an impact on temperatures. If you look at the world of design and you look at all the different countries, you can see what's called the effectiveness coefficient. And what the effectiveness coefficient looks at, it looks at the supply temperatures in relationship to the return and the inside temperature. And if you look at Denmark, it has a really high effectiveness coefficient. And one of the reasons why is because it uses a relative to North America, low supply temperatures, and they work with really large delta T's to get the return temperature back as low as they possibly can. This temperature drives the efficiency. When you have low temperatures coming back to your boiler, you get the high efficiencies out of it. If you get the high temperatures, then you destroy the efficiencies. Okay, does that make sense to you guys? For those guys that understand boilers and chillers and heat pumps, this return temperature is really, really important. Okay, we don't want to ignore it. So you can go through all the different countries and you can look at their traditional designs. And here we are down at the bottom, and our traditional designs are using high temperature supplies with very narrow delta T's, so we end up with high return temperatures, which is really bad for efficiency. Okay. All right. So this is some of the work that Kilkus actually did, and Leo knows Kilkus. He's Dr. Kilkus. He's met him a couple of times. So what this talks about is it just takes a look at the different heat exchangers, and it looks at the ratio of the fluid temperature compared to the air temperature. And so with radiant systems, they have a very small differential simply because they have this very large surface area. But with fan convectors and radiators and baseboards, they have a very large or much larger fluid temperature to air temperature. And in order to get these low temperatures that we use with radiant, you actually physically have to oversize the radiator. So it's almost to the extent of almost 2 to 3 to 4 times the factor. So if you want to get a section of baseboard behaving like a radiant floor, you almost have to put in 4 times as much baseboard as you do with the floor heating systems. Okay? And again, it goes back to that ratio of surface area and temperatures. So why is this important? When we look at combustion efficiency, okay, this comes out of the ASHRAE handbook, this graph. So it's just basically a graph that says anywhere along this graph is going to define what the boiler efficiency is going to be, and it's a function of the return temperature. So if we want to get 98 or 97% efficiency out of a combustion-based boiler, the only way to do that is to get return temperatures coming back through the boiler that are in this low temperature range. Okay? There's no point putting in a condensing boiler and running it at 180 degrees and calling it efficient. Okay? There's nothing efficient about that. In fact, it's almost fraud in my book. Right? If you're going to sell somebody on a high efficiency boiler, you've got to make that boiler behave like a high efficiency boiler, and the only way to do that is to get low return temperatures back through it. Okay? So you can do that a couple of ways. You can use weather compensators, which will help you for part of the year, but not all of the year, and you can look at your heat exchanger designs. You can see here like the traditional cast iron designs with high temperatures, again, running in the 180, 200 degrees Fahrenheit, that you're only going to be in that 84, 85% efficient. Even if you put in a 97% efficient boiler, it doesn't matter. The temperatures coming back to the boiler are too high for it to actually achieve its efficiency rating. All right, so that's how we looked at the temperatures. So when we get to poor buildings with small heat exchangers, high temperatures, really inefficient buildings, and really inefficient mechanical systems. When we got into the high performance building with the large surface area heat exchangers, low temperatures in heating, and really high efficiency in our systems. This systems here, you can't use heat pump technologies. These pump systems here, you can. That's the difference, just simply by changing the building and changing the heat exchanger design. Allows you to move from one system to another. Okay? All right, then we looked at, from an environmental point of view, temperatures, moisture in the indoor environment. And the first thing we looked at was vapor pressures as a result of temperature. So for those, of course, that have taken the building science studies, you know that as you take a fixed humidity ratio, if you raise that temperature, and you'll increase the vapor pressure. So if you want to have bad buildings and problems related to moisture, have high humidity and high temperatures, because what it'll do, also drive them, based on vapor pressures, it'll go from high to low. So you want to move the moisture into a wall, just keep the moisture and raise the temperature, and it'll do that. Okay? If you want moisture to go from the outside in, get the wall wet, hit it with some sunlight. Changes the whole performance on the wall. Okay? Same thing with ceilings. So we looked at that and said, okay, well, then let's keep the humidity low and our temperatures at reasonable conditions. And so we know that at operative temperatures of around 20 degrees of Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, at between 20, or I'll say 30 to 50% relative humidity, that's a nice place to be, not only from a thermal comfort point of view, but also from an energy point of view and also from a building science point of view. Then we looked at VOC emissions off of different materials. So if you want materials to outgas, again, raise the humidity and raise the temperature. If you don't want the materials to outgas, keep the temperatures down and keep the humidities down. Control them. If you control the environmental factors, you will control the VOC emissions. Okay? That's part of the equation. Certainly the other one is to pick low VOC materials. So this is actually using IA Quest. Anybody familiar with IA Quest? It's an NRC IRC tool. It was developed by your tax dollars. It's free. So you can actually, if they're still making it available, because basically our government is shut down on the building research divisions. So it's a good thing you guys from BCIT are around, because I don't know where research is going to happen in Canada other than maybe Waterloo, or else, I don't know. Right? So that software tool allowed you to take a space, create the geometry in it, and then create the indoor finishes in it, and then you can model the VOC emissions over however many times and whatever cycles you wanted in the heating cycle. You could cycle it however many times a day you wanted, and it would put out these these reports. Okay, then we looked at the stability of hygroscopic materials, such as wood. We said, okay, what creates stable conditions for wood? And of course, it's to keep the moisture content within this range. So we know that when you have higher moisture contents, then of course you're going to change the dimensional stability of the wood as you get into lower ranges. Well, it just so happens that this 6 to 14% moisture content in wood also corresponds to environmental conditions that are around 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 40% relative humidity, plus or minus 10%. So if you can keep the spaces in those reasonable temperatures during the heating and cooling and control the humidity, that you would also create dimensional stability in hygroscopic materials. Okay, so then we also looked at discomfort. Respiratory discomfort also is a function of temperature and humidity. And again, this goes back to the work that was done by some of the Danish guys. And so they looked at, again, the PD, the percentage of people dissatisfied. So they found that when you start to end up with high humidities at high temperatures, you're going to have a corresponding number of people complain about the space. So if you don't want people to complain from an environmental perspective, humidity and temperature, keep the humidity down again, sort of in that 30 to 50 range if you can, and in and around that 70 degrees, 68, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you'll have the least amount of people complain about the environment. All right, and then if you look at how that fits in with the ASHRAE, well, it fits in quite nice. So all of these control of moisture, in terms of dimensional stability and vapor pressures and respiratory comfort, all of that fits in really nice within the ASHRAE thermal comfort standard. So again, there's 60% there, there's 20% there. So if you can keep the moisture in this area, and you can keep the temperature, operative temperature, between that sort of 70 to 80 degrees box, then you'll also satisfy the conditions for thermal comfort. So we went through the database and we looked at these buildings that had these conditions, the ones that were being controlled and the ones that weren't being controlled. Obviously in the more higher performing buildings, particularly those that were going for LEED, versus the poor performing buildings, they had no control over these parameters. They basically put in whatever mechanical system and they just said to clients, you're on your own, you're uncomfortable, too bad. Right? So there was no consideration in the poor performing buildings for the occupants. Okay, and then of course, we already mentioned this, the work that Professor Olesen did in terms of temperature, again on the body. So again, we know that if we keep our temperatures in this area here, and that these will be the resulting temperatures due to ambient conditions, but if we start to see rising temperatures, then we're going to start to see rising temperatures in the body. If you're in the summer mode and the temperature of the body goes up, and so does the surface, the body has less ability to shed its heat, ergo it starts to overheat, and then will express itself from the point of discomfort. Okay. So that's, we plotted on the graph. We just said, okay, if we look at the temperature of the human body, outside skin temperature, or core temperature, you're in the 98, 99 degrees. And then as you move from the core temperature out to the skin, depending on what part of the body, you're going to move from 100 to say around 80, 82 degrees Fahrenheit, skin temperature for the foot, for example, or 77 degrees. So we know the temperature of the human body was operating there. We knew in the high performance buildings that in terms of radiant floor heating systems that we were also operating in that 80 degrees and less. And we knew in the radiant cooling systems that they were operating above 66 degrees, so 66 to 75 degrees, something like that. So the correspondence there is that in the the low performing buildings with the high temperatures and small heat exchangers, that they had really temperatures that were so far away from what was being found on the human body, and it also destroyed the efficiency of the heating plants and the cooling plants, and that when we looked at high performance building, the temperatures in that building represented what was actually found in the human body. And so that's why we said in the first presentation, if you actually design for the human and work your way out, you'll ultimately end up with a high performance building, because the body already establishes the limitations for the temperatures that you can use. All right. So let's take a look a little bit at low temperature heating and high temperature cooling. And so we're talking about embedded piping systems, but it could be any large surface area heat exchanger. So the principles, of course, apply. All the heat transfer, convection, conduction, and radiation. And the amount of radiation, it doesn't matter whether it's on a floor, wall, or ceiling, it's still the Stefan-Boltzmann equation. You're going to have so much energy per differential. But convection is a little bit different. When you do radiant floor cooling, for example, so the air sits on the floor, what ability does a cool floor have to change the density of the air? How much influence would it have? Not a lot. So the convective component actually goes down a lot, in fact. Okay? But when you do a radiant cooled ceiling, what impact does the radiant cooled ceiling have on the density of the air? Right, because it scrubs so that you have the rising density comes up in contact with the cold air. That removes the energy out of the air, reduces the density, or increases the density, and then the air, of course, drops down. So the convective component is a function of whether you're doing heating or cooling, and whether it's from the floor, ceiling, floor, or the wall. Okay? So all of those come into play. And then from an energy point of view, what we're looking for is that in the heating mode, we want the return temperature going back to the boiler or the heat pump as low as we possibly can. And in the cooling mode, we want the water going back to the chiller or the heat pump as high as we possibly can. All right? Okay, so I'm going to introduce the ASHRAE nomograph. I'll improve the graph here. I just want to show you some of the things that are important here. This nomograph allows the designer to ultimately end up with fluid temperature. The fluid temperature is a function that we're going to come down here, and we'll get to a different screen here in a second. But the fluid temperature comes from here, which is a function of the spacing, which comes from here, which is a function of the floor characteristics, which are going to be these lines up here, which is a function of the building performance. So whether you're talking about building performance, fluid temperatures, floor coverings, something on this chart is influenced or influences one of the standards in ASHRAE or LEED or Energy Star or the ISO standards. And I've just plotted them up here for you to see. So it's an incredibly important graph to know, because it has so much influence or influences so many codes and standards around the world. All right, so this is how it looks, and we'll give you the geography of the graph, and then I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how it actually physically works. And once you get it, it's like, who uses the psychometric chart here? Okay, so once you know how to use the psychometric chart, it's one of the most elegant things in your toolbox. And so this is going to be one of those tools for you. So let me just explain what's going on here. So this is the flux, okay? And what I've done is I've shaded out, so this is the poor buildings, this is the moderate, and then down here would be the good buildings, okay? So good buildings, bad buildings, okay? That's the BTUs per hour per square foot, or for those that are working in SI, watts per meter squared. These sloped lines here represent the flooring characteristics. Now, what it means is that in the lower values, these here represent flooring that is very, very conductive, or ceilings that are very, very conductive. So metal ceilings, masonry floors, so concrete tile, terrazzo, these types of surfaces. But when you get over into here, these represent more of the resistance or lower conductivity floors, so wood floors with carpet on them, for example. Okay? So obviously this is going to, wherever we are in our flooring characteristics, is going to have an influence on our selection and our design. These lines here, for those that are at the back and you can't see that, those are your spacings, your tube spacings. Okay? Now there's no law that says you have to use, at least in the world of engineering, maybe here in BC, you guys regulate tube spacing at residential level. Okay, so it's basically good practice whether you use 6 inches on center, 9, 12, whatever. And we'll come back to that because that has a major influence on the fluid temperature. Okay? The tighter the tube spacing, or the greater the density, the lower the temperature in heating and the higher the temperature in cooling. So it's very, very important. To this day, it just drives me crazy that people try to save money on jobs by reducing tube spacing, and yet it has a huge influence on the efficiency of the plant. It also has a huge influence on what I call the surface efficacy on the floor. So wide spacing have large temperature drops, tight spacing has less temperature drops, right? So why would you want to mess with someone's comfort and their energy for the savings of a few bucks for PEX pipe? It's like on a large job, it represents maybe 1% of the total project. That's the last place you guys want to save money. So for those that are doing engineering work, tubing is not where you save the money, okay? And all the tube manufacturers say, yes! Whoever you are. Okay, so, all right.
4-inch spacing everywhere.
Yes, there you go. So this is how the graph works, and this is why it's really elegant. So if you know what your flux is, and you know what your flooring characteristics are, I'm just going to ignore this here for a second here. We can actually determine the tube or the fluid average temperature based on our spacing. So here's the example. So we take our line straight across at our flux. We just take a line straight across. And then where that line intersects with our first characteristic of flooring, we take a line straight down to our tube spacing, and where that intersects, we make a parallel line with those slope lines and we come down. So what that is telling us here is that at 25 BTUs per hour per square foot with a really conductive floor at 9 inches on spacing, our average temperature is going to be, our AUST, which is our average unconditioned surface temperature, let's assume it's 70 degrees, so 70 plus 25, so 95 degrees. So that says the average temperature in that pipe at design conditions can be 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay?
That's the surface temperature?
Average water temperature. Average water temperature. Okay.
That's figure 9 data, right?
Yeah.
From ASHRAE.
Yeah. Okay. Now, look what happens if the client or the developer decides to change the floor covering from a masonry type flooring to more of a carpet type flooring. Okay. So we're going to shift from this really conductive floor to a really less conductive, more resistive floor, and look what happens. So instead of 25 plus 70, now we're going to be 80 degrees plus 70 degrees. So now our average temperature goes up to 150 degrees. That one decision that the interior designer made or the client made all of a sudden just destroyed the efficiency of your boiler, and it moved you out of the ability to use a heat pump, if that's the preferred method.
Where does that go when you change tube spacing?
What's that?
When you change the tube spacing, let's say, because you've gone up and
Right. So
you
you
got
have-
the floor.
Yeah, exactly. So you can try to do that with a 6-inch spacing, but at some point it just gets impractical. Right? Otherwise you'd end up with 2-inch spacings in some cases, and that's just not going to be a practical application. You wouldn't be able to make the bands. Well, you could find a way to do it, but
They usually typically only go 2-3 degrees difference from 6 to 9.
yeah. So that's why I said earlier why we tried as much as we can to work with interior designers, because they can play a huge role in our world of energy efficiency with these large surface area heat exchangers. They play a big, big role in that. So we need to work with them on these, and they get it. For whatever reason, the interior designers, the professional interior designers get this information. All right, so let's now take another example, and let's just say that we could work with the architect or the client and say, what if we could get you guys to improve your window performance, your enclosure performance, and get the fluxes down from, say, 25, and now see what can happen if we can get them down to, say, 10 BTUs per hour per square foot. So using the same really conductive fluorine at a 10 BTU per hour per square foot flux, now we're talking about average temperatures of 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? Now, that's the average temperature. If you're working, say, with a 10 degree delta T, what's the actual return temperature going to be? It's going to be 10 divided by 2, 5, 80 less 5 is 75 degrees. So for the heat pump guys in the room, what happens to the COP of a heat pump if you can get 75 degrees water going back to it?
Up.
Huh?
Way up.
Way up, right? Just by making that decision on improving the building enclosure and staying with really conductive floors, all of a sudden we change the efficiency of the mechanical plant. Okay? So none of these things are trivial. They're all integrated. Okay? All right.
And shortening loops as well.
Yeah, that'll have some effect.
Give a smaller delta T that way.
Yeah, you can incorporate that in the design for sure. So going back to our efficiencies, you can see that again, to get these 80, 75 degrees, that's what's going to deliver our high efficiency on our boilers. But if we end up with the higher temperatures, the 150 degrees over here, we've destroyed it. Almost 10%, just by the floor covering. Okay, let's look at cooling. So the cooling mode is the same process. We just take our flux and we intersect with our fluorine, take a line straight up, and then we're going to take these values here. And so this is about 12 degrees. So if we're saying our ambient condition is 77 degrees plus 12, minus 12, sorry, is 65 degrees. So that's our average fluid temperature in the cooling pipe. So again, if you're working with a 10 degree delta T, then the water going back is going to be 70 degrees, not 65. So 70 degrees back through the heat pump, and then you've just improved the COP on that heat pump. So not trivial stuff by any stretch of the imagination. So again, looking at the temperatures and looking at your heat pumps, this is what happens to your COPs on it as a function of the supply and the return temperatures for the heating and cooling. Okay, so now I want to talk about the 5 E's. So I want you to take a good look at this picture.
It's been ticking a long weekend.
It's my backyard and water weekend. Okay, so so what I want you to do is I want you to let the water in the pool represent hydrocarbons, so oil and gas, okay, as our prime ones. And what I want you to do is I want you to let the people that are in the pool represent the population of North America, okay, Canada, specifically Canada and the United States. And then what I want you to do is I want you to let the rest of the people represent the rest of the population of the world, and then just ask the question, what happens if we invite everybody else into the pool? Would it change the world as we know it today? Because that's where we're heading. All of these underdeveloped countries that are growing their population bases are demanding more and more on these types of fuel systems. And it's the wrong path. We know it's the wrong path, but we've told everybody in the world that this is the right way to live, and it's not. And I'm going to show you why. Okay, so everybody familiar with skanky drawings, or Sankey drawings, right? When they're done poorly, they're skanky drawings. Okay, so this one is for the United States, but Canada is worse, so I didn't want to show it to you because it probably depress you all. But essentially what it says, here's our sources of energy, and here's where we convert them, and here's where usable energy goes, and here's what's left over. And so when you look at these drawings, and these are your energy sources here, this is all of the conversion that takes place here, make note up here, they call it rejected energy. You're supposed to read wasted energy. It's the same thing. It's not being used. What it tells us that on the continent of North America right now, for every unit of energy that you want to get useful work out of it, you need to use 2. So go back to that drawing or that picture with the people in the pool, and now you get a really good picture of how inefficient we are with our energy. Because as the world population goes from the 7 billion to the 8 billion to the 9 billion people, if we continue with these kinds of numbers, we're in deep trouble, where we have to make 2 units for every one that we actually get to use usefully. But it doesn't tell the true picture. That's only part of the story. Because every time one of these energy units get converted as a combustion source, it gets changed from ambient conditions to 3,400 or 35 or 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit, and we only need 100. So not only are we losing all of this energy through all of the different losses, we're also destroying all the potential that we could do with 3,400 degrees Fahrenheit. You guys see that? This is the real problem that we have as a society today. The energy efficiency is important. This is about 50%. But the exergy efficiency, and I'm going to show you how we calculate that, is around 6%. It's really, really bad. Okay? All right. So I'm going to show you a series of slides. And what I want you to do is I want you to look at these pictures from a point of entropy. Okay? When we have cooling towers, and this is like the biggest oxymoron. There's nothing cool about a cooling tower at a power plant. When you look at them through the eyes of a thermographic camera, you can see how uncool they are. Okay? So a lot of entropy. Okay? Energy here that's not being used, that's getting released into the atmosphere. Okay? We see this. People think this is steam. It's nice and safe and whatnot. But this is actually what, from a thermal perspective, is actually going on at a power plant, cooling tower at a power plant. Geothermal, right? Still get to see the plume, but it's the energy coming from the ground. Okay? From an entropy point of view, although we have entropy here, we're not taking hydrocarbons and converting them and destroying that exergy. Okay? We look at wind power, very low entropy systems. Okay? Low exergy. When we look at hydropower, very low entropy, low exergy systems. Okay, same thing with PV, solar PVs, and also the solar thermal. This is Drake Landing, just south of Calgary. Anybody familiar with Drake Landing? Okay. It's kind of an interesting project. Economically, it doesn't make sense. From an engineering point of view, it's great. Okay. There's a very high exergy efficiency system because all of the energy here goes into storage at fairly moderate temperatures, and then it's extracted during the winter for heating, and then goes back into the buildings, and so it's a regenerative process. But that whole facility, there's none of this high loss of entropy, okay? Very low entropy, high exergy systems. And then this is one of the universities that Peter Rumsey did, and Peter Rumsey also did the info system in India. And it's a very, again, low entropy, high exergy efficiency cooling system. So what do we mean by that? So what they do during the evening there is they spray water at night up onto the roof. So they have both the evaporative cooling and they have the night sky radiation cooling. So the water is cooled by those two mechanisms, then it's collected in a gutter, and then it's taken down to a cistern. So all night it's actually cooling that cistern down, and then during the day, then they pump that cooled water back through the radiant floor cooling system to cool the building down. So cooling without compression, okay, and heating without combustion. Okay. That's what we need to focus on as architects, engineers, and designers. All right, so that's that part. Now I want to talk a little bit about efficacy. And so efficacy is a great word, and as it relates to thermal comfort and buildings, the Romans had it right, and the Greeks had it right. But even before them, the Koreans and the Chinese had it right. And even before then, up in Alaska, there's an old archaeological site there, an old radiant system. It goes back to, I think the carbon dating was 1500 BC or something like that. Anyways, they looked at their buildings as heat exchangers, and they said, let's convert the entire floor into a heat exchanger. And of course, they drafted smoke underneath the floors through the hypocausts and through the walls. And these were very large surface area heat exchangers using low temperature smoke, but because the entire floor was used, it had very high efficacy. You could walk anywhere within those buildings and there would be nice comfort. Okay? And then when their civilization died, the boneheads that replaced them thought that it was a good idea to build these huge castles and put in a fireplace. And of course, as long as you were around the fireplace, you were fine, right? But if you were in the back quarters, you froze your off, right? And so these had very poor efficacy. Okay? And some of the research work right now that's going on with split heat pumps and is, if you look at some of the DOE research, where they're actually only putting in one head on a house, or two heads at the most, very poor efficacy. Great energy, but the people are complaining about hot and cold spots in the space. Okay? So the Romans and the Greeks, the Koreans and the Chinese, the Russians, and even the early settlers in America had it right with these really large surface area heat exchangers, very high efficacy, and everybody that followed these guys with the small heat exchangers, high intensity, got it wrong. Okay? They're nice when you're near them, as long as you can stand the fire. Right? Talk about radiant asymmetry, that's what causes radiant asymmetry. You stand in front of a fire, your backside gets cold, so you turn around. That's radiant asymmetry. All right.
Could there be something wrong with the theory though, because all the guys that were crazy are still living and all the other ones are dead?
We'll leave that for our next class. That's our Psychology 101 class. So. All right, so then we plotted that on our, so we just said, okay, when you got the bad buildings with high high fluid temperature, small heat exchangers, they had really bad efficacy. So when you take bad buildings that use, fan coils or fan convectors or baseboards, you end up with hot and cold spots. Okay, it becomes uncomfortable. But when you got into the high performance building with the large heat exchangers and the low temperatures, that these had very good efficacy. Okay? And you can plot that. You can take post-occupancy surveys and you can look at the thermal comfort complaints that were made in the old buildings, and you can look at the thermal comfort complaints that are made in new buildings, and there's a difference. Okay? So that's where that went on that one. All right. So right now, we are bombarded with this save energy. And as engineers, you know you can't save energy, right? You can't make it, you can't destroy it. It's just there. It just goes from one form to another. But what you can destroy is what's called exergy. And the problem we have today is that society is being bombarded with this message about saving energy. That will save us, saving energy. And I'm going to show you why that's wrong. Okay, so intuitively, society has a really good sense of what is appropriate use of energy. Like you would never show up with this industrial piece of equipment to plant flowers in your garden. Okay? You would never use, well maybe some of you might use a sledgehammer to pound in a finishing nail. It's an industrial tool for a non-industrial application. Okay? You would never show up with this to mow your lawn, right? And you would never water your lawn with the fire department resources when you'd rather have your kid up there with a garden hose, right? So we know these things are what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate. We all can get a sense of energy constipation. You know what happens when you get behind a slow-moving vehicle and you want to go fast, right? You get that sense of frustration, right? So you know what's right and what's wrong. And we know you can have a sense of energy exhilaration when you get beside really fast-moving vehicles. Okay, so we have that sense. But when it comes to architecture, we totally lose it. Okay? This is the Aqua Tower building in Chicago, and when it was commissioned, it won all the greenie weenies came out of the closet, and they gave it all the flowers and the bouquets and all the write-ups and all that kinds of stuff, until the thermographic guys came around. And then all the publications went away.
Nice big radiator.
I was there in August and had the heat on.
Is that right? Yeah.
It was freezing.
It's absolutely insane. And
It was a rainy day and it was freezing inside.
Yeah. So these fins are exactly that. They didn't put in thermal bridges or thermal breaks between them. And I was in Chicago several times during the construction. I took photographs all the way through the project. And you could tell, even when the second or third layer was going on, this was going to be a problem. And so these fins are like conveyor belts. They're like conveyor belts for mass and energy, moving it back and forth in and out of the structure. Now, this building is, I don't just pick on this building, it just makes great photography. But there's lots of buildings like this in North America. They're all over the place. This one just happens to use a lot of energy, and it just makes it, it's just a good example of thermal bridging. So the 51 million BTUs of energy, of course, is huge. But it's 51 million BTUs of energy at 3,400 degrees Fahrenheit. And so what I want you to do in your own practices, and as you drive around buildings and in your travels, don't just look at the building load. Ask the question, what temperature is being created inside that building to keep it conditioned? When we only need 100 or 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and yet these buildings are being conditioned at 3,400 degrees, it's absolutely insane. Okay? All right, So I'm going to show you one of the calculation processes on calculating exergy efficiency. So for the math guys, you'll like this. So what we do is we take natural gas. We'll start with natural gas. We're going to go to wood. We'll go to solar thermal. And I think we went to geo. I think of the 4 things that I compared. And we looked at their exergy value in reference to soil. Okay, so we used, soil was a good temperature because it rarely changes. You know, get down 6 to 8 feet, it's always constant. Okay, so we used soil temperature as our reference temperature, and we compared it to these other temperatures. So,
Must have been Alberta.
okay, yeah. So there's yeah, it was actually. So there's our you can see our exergy value. So when you take the exergy or the temperature of the natural gas and you compare it to our soil temperature, this becomes our exergy value. So it's a high value source, natural gas, right? Now, if we take wood, which has a much lower combustion temperature, you can see how its exergy is still high, but it's less than the natural gas, right? Then we looked at solar thermal, and of course, you can see the exergy value goes lower, and then we looked at heat pump, non-combustion based, and you can see it's lower here yet, okay?
You're not factoring in how hot the sun is.
There's, okay, so yeah, so there's a lot of things in this analysis that isn't here, but I'll give you a paper if you want to get the nitty gritty. I'll give you a paper for you to read. Okay, so those are the exergy values. Now, one of the messages you want to get from this is that in exergy efficient design, you want to match the exergy value with the system. So in other words, it doesn't make any sense taking a high exergy source like natural gas and putting it with a low exergy load like radiant systems. The better match is to take geothermal that's hydro-based or solar thermal and match it with the radiant system, because the radiant system is a low exergy load and the solar and the geo are low exergy sources. So exergy efficiency is all about matching load with source. To get high exergy efficiency from a natural gas combustion, what you ought to do is use like trigeneration, okay, or cogeneration, or something like that, where you're actually taking the gas, converting water to steam, using the steam to produce power, and then through a series of cascading heat exchangers, extract all of that temperature out until you get down to that low-grade energy that you can use then for conditioning people in spaces. And I'm going to show you an example of that, where that makes sense. Okay, that's a high exergy efficiency system. Radiant with geothermal that's hydro-based is also a high exergy efficiency system because the loads and the sources are matched.
We have such a difficulty here in that our second tier electrical power is 2.5 times that of gas. So we really struggle between what we should do and the economics on the other side of the fence.
Right, and that is one of the problems with exergy efficiency analysis is the economics. But we'll show you, that full stop, I agree with that statement 100%, and that's a challenge. There's ways to improve the economics, and district energy is one of them. We actually can consolidate houses around energy systems that have a high exergy, and the Danes are very good at that. People in Denmark have this thing all figured out. A good part of their country is based on exergy efficiency. So, and I'll actually talk about one of their projects, because they have some solar district energy systems. They're solar-based, not combustion-based. It's a beautiful, beautiful marriage. All right. Okay, so that's the exergy value, but now we need to take a look at how that relates to our heating system. So I've taken the room temperature and compared it to soil, so you can see obviously very low exergy source load marriage there. So now what I want to do is I want to take the natural gas exergy source and compare it to the exergy load of the room at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see because of the ratio between the 34 and the 68 degrees Fahrenheit that we have very poor exergy efficiency. And this occurs in every home and in every building across the continent where we're using combustion to condition people in spaces. It's because the source temperature is so much higher than what we need that we lose all of that ability to do more work. We're not extracting all of the work that we can get out of those systems. Now, look what happens when we look at wood. You can see that we've gone up a little bit, but not a whole bunch. Again, because of the high temperatures. Then we can look at it with solar thermal, and it jumps, it makes a big jump, because the solar thermal system is gonna produce 220, 240, somewhere in that area of the temperatures. And as we come down in our source temperature, it starts to match or become closer or more in harmony with the temperatures that we need for conditioning people in spaces. And as a result, then we get really a much higher exergy efficiency. And then when we look at heat pumps, again, that are hydro-based, again, low temperatures, again, at a low temperature space conditions, we end up with really high exergy efficiency because the source matches our load. Now, if that heat pump uses combustion as its source, then it changes everything.
By combustion, you mean natural gas?
Natural
fire,
gas, coal,
electricity.
oil,
Right.
whatever is going to generate that high temperatures, that's what we have to look at.
So how do you account for that when, if you have districts that are using combustion energy to derive their electricity? So all this gets kind of thrown out the window,
So-
because your electricity might, say in the US, there are areas where the electricity is actually being generated by coal fire.
Right. So these are obviously very simple examples because they don't take into consideration all of the components in the energy system, right? So for here tonight, this is just an introduction of what this principle is all about. But to get into that into more detail, you have to take every energy conversion in the chain to actually get the true exergy efficiency of that system. Okay. That's not in my pay scale. That's in Kilkus's pay scale. All right. Okay, so that's why I said earlier that the greatest paradox of this century is the fact that as building performance goes up, our need for high temperatures for heating and low temperatures for cooling goes down. But the energy source has not changed. And so we're actually becoming more exergy inefficient every time we improve the building efficiency without changing the heating and cooling factor. You guys see that?
Related to this, Robert, we have incentive programs right now that are providing cash up front to put in efficient boilers, and they're being dumped into high temperature loads. Do you have any policy advice?
Yeah, put an engineer on the board.
We have so many condensing boilers in the lower mainland that were put in the 80s, late 70s, like hydropulse when they came out. And they were all put into 190
Boom
degree
boxes.
baseboard systems.
That's
And
exactly my
everybody's wondering,
point.
well, why isn't our fuel bill going down? Well, that's why. And that's why when we had that conversation a little bit about the 936 on the phone, I'm not sure if you were on there, that came up. They're forcing 90% efficient boilers, and they want to get rid of the atmospheric. And well, really, you're not doing anything by forcing them to go to the 90%. Like, it doesn't really.
Exactly, they haven't considered the water temperature as the focus of
We're not even looking at it. It's like you said, we got to go energy efficient without even thinking about the
It's
effect.
a dangerous road to go on, right? So let's keep going on this. So this is probably the big message here is that our source of available hydrocarbons is fixed and it's depleted. And I'm not here to debate how much or how long. Okay, that's not for me, again, it's beyond my pay scale. And I don't have a magic bottle to look into in the future, okay? But it's enough to say that for every gallon that we take out of the ground and burn, no one's putting another gallon back in. At least not that I'm aware of. Anybody know any different? Okay, so what's happening is that we have a depletion of industrial grade fuel sources that are being used for non-industrial applications such as architectural applications. And so as the population increases, so goes the increase in architectural systems, so building engineers, building materials, all that kinds of stuff. And of course, so our demand for these hydrocarbons is going to increase unless we do something. Unless we do something, where tomorrow when another 100,000 people build another 100,000 homes, we're going to use another 100,000 barrels of oil that can produce 3,400 degrees Fahrenheit when we only need it to do 100. And once that energy is converted, entropy is created and the exergy gets destroyed, but the energy is always conserved. That's the basic fundamental laws of thermodynamics, right? So you can't, as a society of engineers and architects and contractors, make the statement that by putting in high efficiency boilers we're being sustainable, because that's a flaw. There's a serious flaw in that statement. All right. So, flying into Calgary, coming from the north, flying south, there's this example. And what we have is there's an industrial facility out there that just has all kinds of heat available. And right around that facility are all of these industrial commercial buildings, shops and markets and that kind of stuff, some housing. And they all need low-grade heat, right? And you would think, like the engineer looks at this and goes, this is easy, right? Lots of heat, no heat, just move it from here to here, right? And that scenario plays over and over and over again across the continent of North America, where we have all of these plants producing all of this excess energy, and nobody will move it for political reasons from one place to another. It's insane. We have a project that didn't go ahead in Alberta. It was up in Grand Prairie. The pulp and paper mills were doing an expansion, and across the pulp and paper mill was going to be a commercial development, literally like a quarter of a mile away. And this plant was going to have all of this excess heat. And so the two parties got together, the developer and the pulp and paper mill, and said, you know, let's create a partnership. Well, they couldn't get beyond the politics. As soon as the mayor and all of the aldermen and all of the tax people and all the lawyers got involved, it just got too complicated and too difficult, and they just said, forget it. And so today, you have this huge commercial building, commercial buildings across the highway from a pulp and paper mill, and the two don't talk. And that happens all the time. All right. I want to point out another silly thing that goes on, okay? This is a typical plume out of a residential furnace or a boiler that's operating. And I want to talk about setback thermostats. Knowing what you know now, okay, about exergy, when we take and we convince people that if you move the thermostat from 72 to 68 degrees, you're going to save 6 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the basement, it's running at 3,400 degrees. It doesn't matter how low you set the thermostat back. You can set it back however low you want until you fix the source. That setback thermostat, on a sustainability point of view, is a drop in the bucket. You guys see that? A million people setting back their thermostat from 72 to 68 degrees does not change the fact that you've created 3,400 degrees per 100 degree Fahrenheit. You see that? It's insane that we try to convince society to look at that from that perspective. Okay, so take that thought and now apply it to all of the million houses that we have that we're telling people to put in high efficiency boilers, but they're not getting the return temperatures, or they're matching high temperature source with low temperature loads, and how inefficient, exergy inefficient that is. How we tell people to put back setback thermostats, and at the same time it's not doing anything as far as sustainability goes. Do that with heating, you can do that with cooling, you can put in all the high efficiency cooling system you like in the space, but if the power is being generated by coal, gas, or oil, it doesn't matter what COP you're getting out of it. It's just a complete mismatch of energy. Okay?
That's a good spot for the homeless to hang out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about the Manitoba Hydro building because it represents everything that we've talked about tonight. And some of the really neat features, if you're not familiar with the building, it was commissioned, I think, probably 3 years ago. So this is, I think, its 4th year that's probably been something like that. Double facade structure. You can see all actually opening windows. So I don't know how many high-rises in North America that are 20 or 30 stories that have opening windows. Not very many of them. Okay, so this has opening windows. What you're looking at here is a solar chimney. This provides some really neat functions. So in the summertime, what it does, obviously, is it can create a huge draft. So what they do, by having this heat exchanger up there and these open windows, they take advantage of the stack effect. And so the building is naturally ventilated during the summer months when this is providing this function. In the winter months, they actually extract the heated air that builds up in the chimney and they pull it down into an air-to-air heat exchanger for ventilating the garage. So really nice use of solar chimney. And I took this photograph, which is the old power plant chimney next to the solar chimney in the Manitoba Hydro, and it's just a really comparison between old and new, where this was running high temperature, lots of particulate pollutants, who knows what other gases that were in there. From an air quality thing was bad, from a thermal point of view was bad, And yet, the new chimney is the solar chimney, and it's an incredible thing to see this building, and buildings like this that work with these kinds of features. Radiant heating and cooling throughout, all displacement, ventilation, dedicated outdoor air systems, and the primary plant in this is with heat pumps, water heat pumps. And they have a peaking load plant in there that's gas powered. They have 6 boilers in there, and I think in the last 3 years, in the worst case scenario, maybe 2 or 3 of them had to kick in for like 20 hours and 30 hours. For the most part, the building just all ran on hydro based. So from an exergy point of view, there's probably no other building in the world that I'm familiar with, they may exist, I just don't know about them, that has such high exergy efficiency, that was designed around the occupant, that meets all the criteria for sustainability and indoor environmental quality. It's just and it's in Canada, right? Which is cool. So this is the architectural drawings on it. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time. You can actually get this online. I would encourage you to do that, to actually just Google Winnipeg, Manitoba Hydro Building, and you can read all about the features and benefits. But there's the displacement ventilation there. There's the radiant cooling, radiant heating system, the natural ventilation, open windows, and the solar chimney there, and the heat extraction in the winter. All right, so that's how we built the graph. Okay, so we looked at all of the loads. What was a bad building? What was a good building? What were the temperatures associated with bad buildings? What were the temperatures associated with good buildings? What was the efficacy like? What were the temperatures that we could use to condition in people and spaces? Were they low temperature sources like solar and geothermal, or was it combustion based where we had high temperatures? We looked at, from a safety point of view, high temperatures in terms of scalding. When you end up with radiators that run at high temperature, they're unsafe. We looked at things like gypsum starts to break down at around 136, 140 degrees Fahrenheit, so you don't want to run that at high temperatures. We looked at particulate emissions, we looked at VOC emissions. All of these things along these lines here represent other environmental factors that are associated with bad buildings. We looked at, and of course those become less when you get into the good buildings. We looked at discharge air temperature. DOAS systems were all in this human temperature range. We looked at floor temperatures for heating and cooling, all within the temperature of the human body. And we just started to put all this stuff together, and that's how we built the graph. And so one of the messages that we came out of this paper that we delivered here in Vancouver is that forget all of the energy codes. Like, just throw them in the garbage. They're too complex, there's too many of them, and no one understands. They all pretend that they do, but nobody does. So, okay? And just all you have to do is make one statement, and that is that the building shall not have, for heating or cooling, any fluid temperature 77.5 degrees plus or minus 22.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's it. Call it the end of the day. Okay? 77.5 degrees plus or minus 22.5 degrees, and that's all you can use for heating or cooling. If it's beyond that, you can't use it. If it's below that, you can't use it. You have to work with that particular range. And if you put that clause in there, it would force the architects and the clients and the engineers to be creative with their architectural designs and to find really good exergy efficiency solutions, as they did with the Manitoba Hydro Building, as they did with NRL, as they did with the Bullet Center, as they did with the Infosys Building in India. Okay? 77.5 degrees Fahrenheit plus or minus 22.5 degrees, and get rid of all the other codes. And you would be done, right? Because you would be forced to look at these principles.
So I'm sorry, I just have to ask a really naive question, but at that sort of a working fluid temperature, are you suggesting that a high temperature source can't be operated at that sort of a working fluid temperature?
So you're saying like you wanted to have a high temperature plant?
Yeah.
So the only way that you would be able to support that kind of a statement is if that plant was doing something else, like power generation.
Right.
Like it was part of a power generation scheme. Okay? But if that wasn't the case, then no, then you wouldn't be able to use combustion right off the bat. It would be eliminated. You couldn't use it. You'd have to use geothermal with hydro, or PV, or wind, or something like that. Okay?
And you wouldn't be able to use it because
the exergy
amount of energy required to heat your building is only available at a high temperature?
Not the amount, the quality.
And the reason why I'm just envisioning, and again, really naive question, but I'm just envisioning a situation where you have a high temperature source and you have a high temperature primary loop, but but you have a low temperature secondary. Is that not possible?
So here's actually where your statement would actually make sense. Like if you had like a geothermal system, and I'm not saying geothermal heat pump system, but an actual ground source system that was operating at a high temperature.
Yes, yes.
That's a great example because the ground, like if you drill down deep enough, you can get really high temperatures, right? But these are non-combustion based temperatures. And so if you can extract that ground heat, use power, and then take waste heat.
But at a combustion-based temperature, could you not get down to that operating temperature?
You can, but you're doing it by wasting heat. You're doing it by introducing a cooling to bring that down,
Why would you?
or
No, you could.
or to exhaust that.
Yeah, you could.
Why can't you use a small volume primary loop at high temperature, working with a low volume secondary loop at low temperature?
Yeah, so if you could
Just inject
Yep.
a limited amount of heat at high temperature into a low temperature secondary.
So if you can it's called cascading your loads. If you can
Yes.
cascade down your loads and extract and to improve the energy efficiency, then that would make sense.
It would.
Yeah, you know what I mean by cascading the energy down? So you start out with a load temperature and then or a source temperature and then you have a load temperature.
Yes.
Okay? Rather than going direct, which is really actually inefficient,
Yes.
through that whole distribution chain, you would always be extracting the temperature down.
Yeah. So I'm just envisioning the amount of energy that's in a particular fluid is the volume of the fluid times the temperature differential, or times the temperature of the fluid times the particular coefficient that defines the energy storage capacity of the fluid. And so if you have a very low volume of that fluid at high temperature, and you mix that with a high volume fluid, it will come out at a much lower temperature, will it not?
Sure, you can, like a nuclear plant waste that's exactly what they have, right?
But
Small
is
volume.
there?
That would be a
Are
high
you
action.
suggesting that there's
Yep.
a lot of waste in that interaction?
If you don't use it all, yes.
But why would you not use it all?
That, good question. We should be using it all.
Well, I'm imagining a high temperature source
Yeah.
that puts energy into a high temperature loop, and then you step it down into a low temperature loop. You use that low temperature loop to heat your building. Why would you not be using all of the energy?
So if you can account for every BTU associated with temperature extracted from that loop, like you can actually make an accounting of it
Yes.
without having any entropy losses, then that would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it?
Okay. But
Right?
so I guess my question is, are you suggesting that can't be done?
No. So you should do it.
Okay.
So the accounting is obviously the important thing, right? You go from that, if you go through that, as energy is converted from one form to another, right?
Yeah.
Every time it's converted, you're going to have entropy losses. And if you can reduce those entropy losses,
So I guess what I'm missing, I really like the whole idea that the building has to be very efficient and that your heating system has to be adapted to suit the occupants. I think that's fantastic.
yeah.
I'm a little bit unclear on why a high temperature source can't work in that type of a building.
That's how you get the high temperature source. If it's combustion, you start out with 3,100 degrees.
But I've just asked the question and you told me it was possible.
Well, that's,
So let's just say you have a load that's 100 degrees Fahrenheit and you start out with 3,400 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yes, yes.
In a residential setting, is it possible to do what the cascade? I think the answer is no.
Are you
Well,
talking?
I mean, it sounds to me like we're talking about commercial buildings, all this, we're looking at the Manitoba Hydro building, but.
Right, so we're talking about buildings in
Yes.
general, right? We can come back and talk about residential and commercial, because there's an economic discussion. So in between the conversion processes, if you can't account for all of those changes in the delta T, then it's not an actually efficient system. Maybe we're not understanding on that.
To me, it's really simple. If I take a cup of hot water and mix it with a gallon of cold water, I end up with a not so hot.
But how is that, right, okay, so how is that water generated? How did you heat that water?
Well, I mean, it could be heated by wood, it could be heated by gas, whatever. The point is, if it's a high temperature, what my question is, if it's a high temperature source, and I use that to heat that cup of water,
Right.
and that's a very efficient process, heating that cup of water to 180 degrees,
Right.
and I dump that in a gallon of water at 65 degrees, won't I end up with a gallon of water at 70
Okay,
degrees?
so great question, but you have to start with the source. How is the temperature generated? Because if it came from the ground and it's sustainable, renewable, that's completely different than if you took the oil out of the ground and created the same temperatures. Did you follow that?
But
It's
I
one
mean, I
is a
follow
renew-
that in the sense
His
that,
point,
that it's
his
a,
point was
that
the
it-
combustion temperature of natural gas is at a rate, or all the combustions is at a rate where it's not the best use of the combustion temperature.
Well, and you're not actually getting your water up to 3,200. You're only
So I'll
getting
tell
the
you what,
water at
just so we can,
180 or
there's one or two more
220 or
slides.
thereabouts.
Let's finish
So you're
the
losing
slides and then
3,200
we'll have the
to
discussion afterwards.
yes, please.
Yeah. So one of ASHRAE's, obviously, missions is to serve humanity and promote a sustainable world. So if you're dealing with a fixed resource and you're creating these high temperatures and you're discarding and you're not using it all, that's far from being sustainable. So for us ASHRAE members, obviously this is very important to us. So we've mentioned this thing about sustainability and making statements about sustainability, and certainly these exergy inefficient systems are not sustainable. We can't continue to do that. So when I look at all of the programs that are out there in the world, the BREEAMs and the LEEDs and the R2000s and the Passive House, I mean there's 50 or 60 of them in all in North America. There's so many of them. You can put them all, lump them in a basket, and you can throw around all these words. And at the end of the day, it just comes down to stewardship, right? We could throw, like energy efficiency has lost its meaning, sustainability has lost its meaning, green has lost. None of these words have any meaning anymore. But stewardship, I think, is a word that can retain its integrity. And my personal opinion is that we just forget all that other stuff and just start calling it what it is, which is stewardship. Okay, so that's my message for tonight on this one. Any? Okay, so.
I just want to thank you
Oh, yeah,
for coming.
yeah, you're welcome. My pleasure.
This is
Yeah.
for you.
Oh, thank you
right?
very much. Appreciate that. Thank you very much.
And I also want to make sure we thank Andrew Dyke from Barclay for his display, and Nigel from MCO, and Bill. Where'd Bill go? Bill stepped out for a minute, but did he fall off the chair and he fell asleep there? But just to thank those guys for putting their products on display. I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at them. Hopefully so. But thanks for coming, and really thanks a million for you.
Robert, yeah. I'll stick around and ask. There's some good questions.